Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. They called themselves the good Christians. Their enemies called them heretics. History remembers them as the Cathars, and their story is one of the most haunting tragedies of medieval Europe. Here were people who believed that the material world was inherently evil, created by a false god, a cosmic mistake. They rejected wealth, refused meat, eschewed marriage, and yet, or perhaps because of this, they drew followers from every level of society. Nobles protected them. Weavers spread their message. Women preached alongside men as spiritual equals. In the sun-drenched lands of what is now southern France, they created a civilization that challenged everything the medieval Catholic Church claimed about God, creation, and the nature of existence itself. Tonight, we will walk through lavender fields and fortified towns where two radically different visions of Christianity collided. We'll climb the steep paths to mountain castles where believers made their last stands. We'll sit in candlelit rooms where the good Christians administered their single sacrament to the dying, and we'll stand with 225 souls who chose to walk singing into the flames rather than renounce their faith. This is a story of profound spiritual conviction, meeting absolute political power, of gentle ascetics who threatened an empire simply by existing, of a tolerant, sophisticated culture that was systematically destroyed in the name of religious unity. The Cathars left us no churches, no artwork, precious few of their own writings. What remains are the words of their enemies, the ruins of their castles, and questions that echo through 8 centuries. What makes a belief worth dying for? Can spiritual purity exist in a corrupted world? And what happens when those who preach love encounter those who wield swords in God's name? May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. Feel the veil between past and present growing thin as we cross into the 13th century to the land they called Occitania, where the morning sun turns limestone cliffs to gold and the air carries the scent of wild thyme and approaching storm. Number the two gods. Picture two powers locked in eternal conflict. One, a being of pure spirit and light, creator of souls and the invisible realm of heaven. The other, a dark architect of matter, the demiurge who trapped those pure souls in prisons of flesh and set them wandering through a world of suffering. This was the universe, as the Cathars understood it, not as a single creation under one omnipotent God, but as a battlefield between equal and opposite forces. The good God, they taught, had never touched the physical world. How could perfect goodness create a realm where children starved, where disease ravaged whole villages, where violence seemed woven into the very fabric of existence? No, this broken world with its cycles of birth and death, its hungers and corruptions, must be the work of another power entirely. Some Cathars identified this dark creator with the God of the Old Testament, that jealous, wrathful deity who demanded blood sacrifice and commanded armies to slaughter. Others saw him as Satan himself, the fallen angel who had staged his rebellion by creating his own kingdom of matter to rival God's kingdom of spirit. To be human, in this view, was to be a spark of divine light, imprisoned in darkness. The soul, which belonged to the good God, found itself trapped in a body that belonged to the evil one. Every physical pleasure, every material attachment, every biological urge was another chain keeping the soul bound to this false creation. The only escape was through knowledge, gnosis, the recognition of one's true nature, and complete rejection of the material world. This wasn't merely theology, it was a radical reimagining of existence that turned Christianity inside out. Where the Catholic Church taught that God became flesh in Christ to sanctify the physical world, the Cathars taught that Christ was pure spirit, who only appeared to take human form. Where the Church blessed marriages and celebrated the Eucharist as the actual body and blood of Christ. The Cathars saw both as surrenders to the evil of matter, where the Church built magnificent cathedrals and accumulated vast wealth, claiming these glorified God. The Cathars saw only souls falling deeper into the enemy's trap. The implications rippled outward through every aspect of life. If the physical world was evil, then the Catholic Church, with its vast estates, its golden vestments, its political power, was not merely wrong, but actively serving the dark creator. The Church's sacraments, which claimed to sanctify material things like bread, wine, water, and oil, were not just ineffective, but blasphemous, trying to mix the holy with the inherently corrupt. Even the cross itself became problematic. Why would one venerate the instrument of torture used against the divine messenger? To a Cathar, it would be like cherishing the knife that killed your beloved. Yet this seemingly pessimistic worldview produced something unexpected: hope. If humans were truly sparks of divine light, if their essential nature was pure spirit temporarily imprisoned, then salvation was not just possible, but inevitable. It might take many lifetimes, many incarnations, as souls gradually awaken to their true nature, but eventually, every spark would find its way back to the light. This was far more generous than Catholic doctrine, which condemned unbelievers and sinners to eternal hellfire. The Cathars taught that hell was here, now, this physical existence, and it was temporary. The good Christians, as they called themselves, saw their mission as helping souls remember their divine origin. They wandered the countryside in pairs, dressed in simple black robes, carrying nothing but their book of Gospels. They preached in markets and fields, in noble halls and peasant hovels, always in the local language rather than Latin, always emphasizing the words of Christ about abandoning worldly possessions and loving one's neighbor. They performed no elaborate rituals, built no churches, demanded no tithes. Their very existence was their sermon, proof that human beings could live without violence, without possessions, without participating in the cycles of reproduction and consumption that kept souls trapped in matter. Number, land of the troubadours. The southern sun had always shone differently on Occitania than on the lands north of the Loire. Here, in what would one day be called Languedoc, Provence, and parts of northern Spain and Italy, a civilization had flowered that was unlike anything else in medieval Europe. The very air seemed lighter, filled with the sound of complex poetry, sung to lute and viol, with the scent of jasmine and orange blossom, with a tolerance for difference that would have shocked the stern barons of the north. This was the world of the troubadours, those wandering poet-musicians who had invented the very concept of romantic love. In castle halls from Toulouse to Marseille, these artists competed in elaborate contests of verse and melody, singing not of military conquest or religious devotion, but of the sweet agony of unrequited desire, the nobility of loving an unattainable lady, the transformation of the soul through voluntary submission to love's power. Their language was not Latin, but the beautiful, flowing tongue called Occitan, the language of OC, rather than oil, closer to Catalan than to French, a language that seemed designed for rhyme and metaphor. The great lords and ladies who patronized these troubadours presided over courts that were marvels of sophistication. Eleanor of Aquitaine herself, Queen first of France and then of England, had grown up in this world, her grandfather being the first known troubadour. In these southern courts, women held power unimaginable in the north. They could inherit and rule territories in their own right, patronize artists, engage in theological debate. The Countess Ermengarde of Narbonne ruled her city for 50 years, commanding respect from kings and popes. The four sisters who inherited Marseille governed it jointly, sharing power in a way that defied all northern notions of hierarchy. This cultural flowering wasn't separate from the region's religious diversity. It grew from the same soil. Occitania had always been a crossroads. Ancient Greek colonists had founded Marseille 6 centuries before Christ. Romans had built their first province outside Italy here, leaving behind not just roads and aqueducts, but a tradition of written law and urban sophistication. Visigoths had ruled here, as had Muslims from Al-Andalus. Jewish communities had thrived for centuries, their scholars creating centers of learning that translated Arabic mathematics and philosophy into Latin. In cities like Narbonne and Montpellier, Jewish doctors were sought after by Christian nobles. Jewish merchants facilitated trade between Christian Europe and the Islamic world, and Hebrew poetry influenced troubadour verse. The tolerance extended to religious variation among Christians themselves. While the North was developing an increasingly rigid church hierarchy, the South maintained older, looser traditions. Parish priests often married and passed their positions to their sons. Monasteries followed different rules or made their own. Noble families treated church positions as hereditary property, appointing younger sons as bishops regardless of their spiritual inclinations. This wasn't seen as corruption, but as tradition, the way things had always been done. Into this accepting atmosphere, new religious ideas flowed like water, finding its level. Preachers from the East brought different interpretations of Scripture. Merchants carried theological debates, along with silk and spices. In the markets of Toulouse or Albi, you might hear a Catholic priest, a Cathar perfect, a Jewish rabbi, and a Muslim trader all discussing the nature of God, sometimes heatedly, but rarely violently. The great lords saw their role as keeping peace between these communities, not enforcing religious uniformity. The physical landscape itself seemed to encourage diversity and independence. This was not the flat, open country of northern France, where mounted knights could dominate. Here, steep valleys and sudden gorges created natural boundaries. Fortified villages perched on limestone cliffs like eagles' nests. Every local lord had his impregnable castle. Every town, its ancient rights and privileges. The Count of Toulouse might theoretically rule vast territories, but in practice, power was scattered among hundreds of minor nobles, each jealous of their independence, each following their own conscience in matters of faith. The economy, too, was different from the north. This was not a land of great wheat fields, worked by serfs bound to the soil. The south thrived on trade, crafts, and specialized agriculture. Merchants grew wealthy, importing spices and exporting wine and wool. Skilled artisans, especially weavers, formed powerful guilds that gave them independence from noble control. The famous blue dye from woad plants made fortunes for those who knew its secrets. Cities mattered here as much as castles, and in cities, new ideas spread like fire. Number seeds from the east. The path of dualist thought through history resembles an underground river, surfacing in different places across centuries, always flowing westward from its ancient sources. Long before the first Cathar preacher stood in an Occitan market square, these ideas had travelled thousands of miles and transformed through dozens of cultures, each adding their own understanding to the ancient question: why does evil exist in a world supposedly created by a good God? The thread reaches back to Persia, to the prophet Zoroaster, who lived perhaps 6 centuries before Christ. He taught of Ahura Mazda, the wise lord of light, locked in cosmic battle with Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit of darkness. This wasn't mythology, but theology, a systematic explanation for suffering that didn't require blaming the good God for evil or declaring evil an illusion. The physical world became a battlefield where every human choice between truth and falsehood, light and dark, mattered in the cosmic war. From Persia, these ideas spread in all directions. They influenced Jewish thought during the Babylonian exile. Appearing in later texts as the struggle between God and Satan, they travelled the Silk Roads to India and China, mixing with Buddhist concepts of material existence as suffering. But their most fateful journey was westward, into the Roman Empire of the 3rd century AD, where a Persian prince named Mani created a religion that would haunt Christianity for 1,000 years. Mani taught that the material world resulted from an invasion of the realm of light by the forces of darkness. Particles of light became trapped in matter, and human bodies were prisons designed to keep these light particles separated and weak. Only through extreme asceticism, by refusing to participate in reproduction, consumption, and violence, could the light gradually separate itself from darkness. At its height, Manichaeism spread from North Africa to China, claiming even Saint Augustine as a follower, for 9 years before his conversion to Catholicism. The Christian emperors outlawed Manichaeism, decreeing death for its followers, but dualist ideas had already taken root within Christianity itself. In the Eastern Roman Empire, especially in Armenia and Asia Minor, Christian communities developed their own interpretations. They noticed how the God of the Old Testament, who hardened Pharaoh's heart and sent bears to maul children, seemed different from the loving Father that Jesus described. They questioned how a perfect creator could produce an imperfect creation. They wondered why Paul spoke of the God of this world, blinding unbelievers, implying this world had a different God than heaven. By the 10th century, these questions had crystallized into a movement called Bogomilism, after its founder, a Bulgarian priest named Bogomil, which meant beloved of God. The Bogomils taught that Satan was God's eldest son, who had rebelled and created the material world as his own kingdom. They rejected the Orthodox Church's elaborate liturgy, its veneration of images, its wealth and political power. They practiced a simple Christianity focused on the New Testament, especially the Gospel of John, with its emphasis on light versus darkness, spirit versus flesh. The Byzantine Empire tried to suppress the Bogomils through imprisonment, exile, and execution, but the movement spread like wildfire through the Balkans. It appealed especially to Slavic peoples recently and superficially converted to Christianity, who found in Bogomilism an explanation for why their new religion's promise of salvation hadn't ended their suffering. It attracted intellectuals troubled by theological contradictions and peasants ground down by church taxes. Even some Byzantine nobles secretly sympathized, seeing in Bogomil criticism of church wealth, an echo of their own resentment at ecclesiastical power. The crucial connection came through trade routes. Byzantine merchants carried silk, spices, and ideas along the ancient Roman roads that connected Constantinople to the west. They sailed to Venice, Genoa, and Marseille. They travelled overland through the Balkans to the great fairs of Champagne, and wherever they went, heterodox ideas travelled with them. Crusaders returning from the East brought back more than plunder and relics. They brought questions about whether the Christianity they had killed for was the only or even the true interpretation of Christ's message. Sometime around 1100 AD, perhaps earlier, these Eastern ideas encountered the receptive soil of Occitania. We don't know exactly when or how, whether it was a single charismatic preacher or a gradual infiltration of concepts. But by the middle of the 12th century, what would become known as Catharism had taken firm root. The Western dualists adapted Eastern ideas to their own context. Where Bogomils had challenged the Byzantine Empire and Orthodox Church, Cathars would challenge Rome and the Catholic hierarchy. Where Eastern dualists had remained largely rural and peasant, Western dualists would attract urban craftsmen and even nobility. The transformation wasn't just theological but practical. Eastern dualists had often lived as hermits or in small communities. Western Cathars developed an organized church structure with bishops and deacons. Eastern dualists had passed down their teachings through secret oral tradition. Western Cathars, emerging in a culture that valued written poetry and law, began creating their own texts, translating the New Testament into Occitan, writing theological treatises, keeping records. Number you stand in the market square of Albi. You stand in the market square of Albi on a crisp morning in spring, perhaps in the year 1175. The sun has just crested the red brick buildings, turning the Tarn River into a ribbon of gold. Around you, the familiar chaos of market day unfolds. Farmers have arrived before dawn with cabbages and turnips, their wooden carts creaking under the weight. The cheese sellers have set up their boards, wheels of sheep's milk, cheese-drawing flies that they wave away with practiced irritation. The sound of haggling fills the air in Occitan, that musical language that rises and falls like the hills surrounding the city. You notice them before they begin to speak. Two figures in rough black robes, standing near the fountain, a man and a woman, both gaunt from fasting, both with that peculiar intensity in their eyes that marks the good Christians. The crowd, which moments before was focused entirely on commerce, begins to shift and gather. The cheese seller sets down her cloth. The knife sharpener stops his wheel. Even the children pause their games to listen. The woman speaks first, and this alone marks the moment as extraordinary. Her voice carries across the square, clear and compelling. She opens a small book, bound in simple leather, and begins to read from the Gospel of John in your own language, not the church Latin that sounds like magical incantation. In the beginning was the Word, she says, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But then she explains it differently than Father Bernard does at the church. This Word, she says, this divine light, never touched the corrupt physical world. When it says the Word became flesh, it means only that it appeared to become flesh, like sunlight appears to enter a dirty room without being contaminated by the dust. You feel the crowd lean in, your own body drawn forward despite yourself. These are dangerous ideas, you know. Father Bernard has warned against these heretics who deny that Christ truly died on the cross, who refuse to venerate the Virgin Mary, who claim the Church's sacraments are meaningless. Yet there's something about the way this woman speaks, without threat of hellfire, without demanding money, without that edge of barely contained violence that lurks beneath Father Bernard's sermons. The man takes over, telling the story of the prodigal son, but again with a different meaning. The far country where the son wandered, he explains, is this physical world. We are all prodigal children who have forgotten our true father, squandering our divine inheritance by wallowing with the swine of material existence. But we can return. We can remember. The path home requires only that we recognize this world for what it is. A prison, a lie, a kingdom of shadows. A merchant, you know, Guillaume, the cloth seller, calls out a question. What about marriage? What about children? Are these evil too? The perfect man responds gently, without condemnation. Those who are strong enough, he says, who have received the consolamentum, must abstain from all participation in the cycles of matter. But for believers who have not yet reached that strength, marriage is permitted, even necessary. Not everyone can walk the narrow path immediately. What matters is the direction of your journey, not the speed of your steps. You smell bread baking in a nearby oven, that warm yeast scent that normally makes your mouth water. But the woman is explaining how bread, all food really, is just matter that binds us more tightly to matter. The perfect eat only to keep their bodies barely functioning, and even then they fast completely 3 days a week. You watch their thin hands gesture as they speak, see the hollows in their cheeks, the way their robes hang loose on their frames, yet they don't seem weak. There's a vitality in them, a kind of luminous conviction that makes the well-fed priests look sluggish by comparison. The bell of St. Salvi begins to ring, calling the faithful to Mass. Some of the crowd disperses, crossing themselves as they go, but many stay, including some you wouldn't expect. There's Lady Esclamont's maid and one of the consul's sons, and even old Simon who tends the church gardens. The perfect make no attempt to prevent anyone from leaving. No threats about damnation for those who choose the Roman Church. They simply continue teaching, patient as the limestone cliffs that hold the city. Number, the weavers, and the word. The looms of Languedoc never stopped their rhythm, that steady beat of heddle and shuttle that provided the background music to countless conversations about the nature of God. In workshops from Toulouse to Carcassonne, skilled craftsmen bent over their work, creating the fine woolens and linens that merchants carried to markets across Europe. And as their fingers worked the threads, their minds worked over the ideas that the good Christians brought to their workshops, finding in the very structure of their craft a metaphor for the Cathar understanding of existence. Think of it, the warp and weft, two elements interlaced but never truly united, creating something that appears solid but can be unravelled back to its separate components. Just so, the Cathars taught, were spirit and matter temporarily intertwined in the human condition, creating the illusion of unity while remaining fundamentally separate. The weavers understood this in their bones, in their fingertips, in the decades of muscle memory that guided their work. The textile workshops provided perfect cover for Cathar gatherings. The noise of the looms masked conversation from suspicious ears. The legitimate coming and going of merchants, suppliers and customers meant that Perfect could enter and leave without arousing suspicion. The workshops operated as businesses, but also as informal schools, where apprentices learned more than just their craft. While young hands practiced the complex patterns of twill and damask, young minds absorbed the patterns of dualist thought. The economic independence of the weavers mattered as much as their workshop's convenience. Unlike peasants tied to the land, or nobles bound by feudal obligations, skilled craftsmen controlled their own labour. The guild structure gave them collective power to resist both secular and ecclesiastical authority. A master weaver who had built a reputation for quality could afford to harbour Perfect, to absent himself from Mass, to quietly redirect the tithe money towards supporting the good Christians. The church could threaten hellfire, but it couldn't easily replace the skilled hands that created the textiles everyone, including bishops, desired. The connection went deeper than mere convenience. The Cathar Perfect often came from weaving families themselves. The work attracted thoughtful, patient people, those capable of seeing complex patterns before they emerged, of holding abstractions in mind while performing precise physical actions. These same qualities suited them for the austere life of the Perfect, the careful navigation between spiritual teaching and political danger, the ability to maintain hidden networks of believers while appearing to be simple craftsmen. Consider the workshop of Pierre de la Roque in Fanjeaux, a master weaver whose surviving records provide glimpses into this hidden world. His account books show regular purchases of black wool, far more than the local demand for mourning clothes would require. Black robes for Perfect, perhaps? His employee lists include several women with no surnames, unusual for official documents, unless these women were Perfect who had renounced family ties. His workshop expanded dramatically between 1190 and 1200, despite no corresponding increase in conventional textile orders. But there are payments from nobles known to be Cathar sympathisers, possibly supporting a centre of faith rather than just a business. The weavers carried the faith along trade routes as naturally as they carried their goods. A journeyman travelling to perfect his craft would stay in the homes of fellow weavers, sharing meals and conversations. Ideas spread with the patterns for new designs. The theological debates of Toulouse workshops appeared months later in Milan and Genoa, carried by young craftsmen who discussed the problems of evil as readily as the problems of achieving consistent dye colours. The great textile fairs became informal councils where Cathar bishops could meet under the cover of commercial gatherings. The metaphors of weaving permeated Cathar, preaching to the point where even their enemies noted it. The Perfect spoke of souls entangled in the threads of matter, of the need to separate the divine thread from the material weave, of the pattern of salvation that God had designed before the foundation of the corrupted world. They described their own teaching as threading truth through the fabric of daily life, creating patterns that would only be fully visible when the whole cloth was complete. The workshop hierarchy provided a model for Cathar organisation. Just as apprentices advanced to journeymen and then masters, believers could progress toward becoming perfect. Just as trade secrets were carefully guarded and gradually revealed, spiritual mysteries were taught in stages. Just as the guild protected its members from outside interference, the Cathar Church created structures of mutual support that operated parallel to, but independent from Catholic institutions. Number consolamentum, the single sacrament. In a small room lit by beeswax candles, the dying woman struggles for each breath. Her family surrounds the bed, but their attention focuses on the two figures in black robes who've travelled through the night to reach her. These are the perfect, and they have come to perform the only ritual that the Cathars consider valid, the only moment when divine power directly touches a human soul. The consolamentum, the consolation, the baptism of the Holy Spirit that Jesus himself promised would come after him. The Catholic Church offered 7 sacraments, 7 moments when grace supposedly entered the material world through material means: water, oil, bread, wine. The Cathars rejected them all as attempts to sanctify what could never be holy. Only the consolamentum mattered, because it involved no matter at all, just words, breath, and the laying on of hands. It was simultaneously baptism, confirmation, ordination, and extreme unction, the single door through which a soul passed from bondage to freedom. The woman on the bed has been preparing for this moment for years. As a believer, a credente, she attended Cathar sermons, supported the perfect with food and shelter, lived as moral a life as possible, while still participating in the material world. She married, bore children, ran a household, all the while knowing these were compromises with evil, necessary perhaps, but still chains binding her to the kingdom of darkness. Now, approaching death, she can finally break those chains. The perfect begin with the melioramentum, the ritual greeting that believers offer to those who have received the consolation. Her family members kneel and bow 3 times, asking for the blessing of God and the good Christians. Then comes the examination. Does she forgive all who have wronged her? She whispers, yes. Does she promise, if she recovers from this illness, to never again eat meat, eggs, cheese, or any product of sexual generation? Yes. To never tell a lie, swear an oath, or kill any living thing, not even a chicken, not even in self-defense? Yes. To abstain completely from sexual contact, even with a spouse? Her husband nods his permission, and she agrees. One of the perfect opens the Gospel of John and places it on her head. Both perfect lay their hands on the book and begin the ritual words, a mixture of Occitan and Latin that has been passed down unchanged through generations. They call upon the Holy Spirit to descend, not the Spirit that the Catholic Church invokes, but the Paraclete, the Comforter that Christ promised, the divine breath that awakens sleeping souls to their true nature. The words themselves carry power, not magical power, as the Catholic Church claimed for its formulae, but the power of truth breaking through illusion. The moment of transmission arrives. Through the perfect's hands flows the spiritual lineage, reaching back to the apostles themselves. This is what the Catholic Church had lost when it chose temporal power over spiritual purity, what it had traded for gold and lands and the right to crown emperors. The Cathars maintained the true apostolic succession, passed not through politically appointed bishops, but through those who lived as the apostles lived, owning nothing, preaching freely, healing through faith alone. The woman's breathing changes, becoming deeper, calmer. Those who have witnessed many consolamentums recognize this sign. Something fundamental has shifted. The spark of divine light within her, dormant since her soul's fall into matter, has remembered itself. She is no longer just a believer, but one of the perfect, even if she only holds this status for the few hours or days before death claims her body. If she were to recover, she would have to maintain all the stringent requirements of the perfect life, or risk losing her consolation. This deathbed consolamentum was the most common form, but not the only one. Young people in good health could receive the consolation and join the ranks of the perfect, though this required tremendous commitment. They would leave their families, surrender their possessions, and spend the rest of their lives walking the roads of Occitania, always in pairs for mutual support and credibility, preaching and preparing other souls for liberation. They would fast 3 days a week, eating only bread and water. During 3 40-day periods each year, they would observe even stricter fasts. They would never sleep under the same roof twice, unless illness forced them, never accumulate possessions beyond their black robe and gospel book. The ritual could also be performed in extreme circumstances without the usual preparations. During the Albigensian Crusade, Perfect would console dozens of believers at once. As enemy soldiers approached, knowing that death was better than forcing souls to continue in the prison of flesh without hope. These mass consolamentums, performed in castle courtyards as siege engines broke the walls, or in fields as crusader cavalry charged, became acts of spiritual rebellion, denying the enemy the power to truly defeat those they killed. Number women who preached, exclamant de foi, stood before the assembled nobles and clergy, her voice carrying clearly through the great hall of the Château de Foix. The year was 1204, and the Catholic Church had sent its finest theologians to debate the Cathar perfect, hoping to win back the southern nobility through force of argument. But they had not expected to face a woman, much less one who could quote scripture in Latin, Greek, and Occitan, who could trace the theological implications of their own positions to uncomfortable conclusions, who stood as living proof that the Cathar Church offered women something the Catholic Church never could: spiritual equality. Brother Stephen of Metz, representing Rome, made the error of trying to dismiss her. "It is not fitting," he declared, "for a woman to speak in such an assembly. Return to your spinning, lady, and leave theology to men." The hall erupted in laughter, not at Esclarmonde, but at the northerner, who didn't understand that he had just insulted not only a perfect but the sister of the Count of Foix, a woman who had administered vast estates, negotiated with kings, and commanded more respect than most bishops. Her reply, recorded even by hostile witnesses, was devastating. "If it is not fitting for me to speak, sir, then why have you come all this way to debate with heretics? Are we dangerous enough to require your attention, but not worthy enough to deserve your arguments?" The Cathar Church offered women something revolutionary in medieval terms: the possibility of achieving the highest spiritual status, based solely on their devotion and understanding, not their gender. Women could receive the consolamentum and become perfect, preaching and teaching with the same authority as men. They could perform the consolamentum for others, becoming the direct conduit of the Holy Spirit. They could interpret scripture, lead prayer meetings, counsel believers on spiritual matters. In a world where the Catholic Church barred women from any sacerdotal role, where even abbesses needed male priests to perform sacraments, this was explosive. The numbers tell the story. In the surviving records of Cathar Perfect operating in Languedoc, between 1170 and 1300, women constitute nearly 40%. Entire houses of female perfect existed in every major town, sometimes outnumbering the male establishments. Noble women like Esclarmonde didn't just protect and finance the Cathar Church, they led it. Blanche de Laurac ran a house for female perfect in her castle that became effectively a theological seminary. Corbet de Perella turned Montségur into the spiritual capital of Catharism, providing refuge for hundreds of perfect. But it wasn't just noble women who found liberation in Cathar teaching. The wife of a blacksmith could become perfect and find herself consulted on spiritual matters by countesses. Young women who would have been forced into either marriage or Catholic convents could choose a third path: active ministry. Guilelma Mazzarola, a weaver's daughter from Toulouse, became one of the most sought-after Cathar preachers, travelling throughout Occitania and drawing crowds that regional bishops could only envy. The female perfect developed their own particular approaches to ministry. While male perfect often engaged in public theological debate, women more frequently worked through networks of domestic relationships. They would visit homes to console the sick, teach children, counsel women struggling with difficult marriages. They created informal schools where girls learned to read, using the Gospels as their primary text. They established workshops where women could support themselves through craft work while studying spiritual texts. These feminine spaces became the hidden backbone of the Cathar Church, harder for the Catholic authorities to monitor and suppress than public preaching. The domestic ministry had profound effects. Catholic priests might thunder from pulpits about heresy, but when the lady of the house had received consolamentum from a female perfect she had known since childhood, when the children had learned their letters from perfect, who also taught them weaving and herbalism, when the female perfect had sat beside sickbeds through long nights, while priests demanded payment for last rites, theological arguments carried less weight than lived experience. Consider the career of Arnaud de la Mothe, whose story survives in unusual detail through Inquisition records. Born to minor nobility around 1160, she received the consolamentum at age 20 after her husband's death in battle. For the next 40 years, she travelled constantly throughout the Lorragues region, never spending more than 3 nights in one place. She consoled over 200 people on their deathbeds, taught countless children, memorized the entire New Testament in Occitan, and debated theology with Dominican friars. When finally captured by the Inquisition at age 60, she refused to recant despite torture, declaring that she had found in Catharism what Christ truly promised, that in the spirit there is neither male nor female, neither bond nor free. The Catholic Church found this female ministry particularly threatening, perhaps even more than Cathar theology itself. It undermined the entire structure of patriarchal authority on which both church and feudal society rested. If women could interpret scripture, why not law? If they could mediate between believers and God, why not between subjects and rulers? If spiritual authority didn't require masculine gender, what other forms of authority might also be questioned? Number. Whispers in the twilight. Evening falls gently over the village of Fangeau, that liminal hour when the day's labour ceases and night has not yet claimed the sky. In a modest house near the town's edge, a family prepares for the ritual that has replaced the Catholic Vespers in their hidden faith. No bells call them to prayer, no priest leads their devotion. Just a family gathered around their hearth with one of the good Christians who has walked many miles to spend this night under their roof. The shutters are closed but not barred, the door latched but not locked. They take precautions, but not so many as to arouse suspicion. The mother of the house, Jordana, has prepared a simple meal: bread, wine, spring water, dried apples, and walnuts. The perfect will eat only the bread and drink only the water, but the family may partake of all, for they are merely believers, not yet strong enough to fully reject the snares of matter. The perfect, an elderly woman named Dulcia, whose thin fingers speak of decades of fasting, sits in the best chair the family owns. The children, 3 of them ranging from 6 to 14, watch her with the fascination that children reserve for those who are different yet kind. She doesn't frighten them like the parish priest, with his talk of demons and damnation. Her voice is soft, worn smooth like river stones, as she begins the evening's teaching. "Do you know," she asks the youngest child, "why the swallows fly south when winter comes?" The boy shakes his head. "Because they remember," Dulcia says. "Deep in their small bodies, they remember warmth and light, and they journey toward it no matter how far they must fly. We are like those swallows. Our souls remember a place of pure light, our true home, and we journey toward it through many lives, many bodies, always seeking what we once knew." The father brings out a book wrapped in oiled cloth, hidden beneath the floorboards when not in use. It's the Gospel of John translated into Occitan, each word carefully copied by hand, worth more than everything else the family owns. Dulcia takes it reverently, and by the fire's light begins to read the passages that form the heart of Cathar belief. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. The familiar words take on new meaning in their own language, no longer the mysterious Latin that falls from the priest's lips like incantations. The children understand that they are the light, each of them carrying a spark that the darkness of this world cannot truly touch. Their bodies might hunger, sicken, age, and die, but the light within them is eternal, untouchable, patient. Number, the Bishop of Rome grows troubled. In the Lateran Palace in Rome, Pope Innocent III stood before a map of Christendom, his finger tracing the regions where his authority was becoming more theoretical than real. The year was 1198, the first year of his papacy, and already he could see that southern France posed a greater threat to the Church than any Muslim army or German emperor. Not because of military might or political rebellion, but because of something far more dangerous: indifference. The reports from his legates painted a disturbing picture. In Toulouse, the largest city of the region, Catholic churches stood half empty, while Cathar Perfect drew crowds in the marketplaces. Noble families openly protected heretics, even preferring them as spiritual counselors. Catholic priests lived openly with wives and children, sold the sacraments like merchants hawking wares, and knew less Latin than the average Cathar Perfect knew scripture. Bishops appointed by local nobles treated their positions as inherited property, more concerned with hunting rights than human souls. But it was the systematic nature of the Cathar Church that truly worried Innocent. This wasn't just popular dissent or local corruption that could be addressed with reform. The Cathars had created a complete alternative Christianity with its own hierarchy, theology, and practices. They had bishops in every major city, a network of perfect who travelled established routes, safe houses in every town, and the protection of the most powerful nobles in the region. They were not trying to reform the Catholic Church. They were replacing it. The Pope's advisors offered different solutions. The Cistercian abbots urged peaceful preaching, sending missionaries to win back souls through superior argument and exemplary living. The problem, they admitted quietly, was finding Catholic preachers who could match the Cathars in biblical knowledge, rhetorical skill, and personal austerity. The Cathars lived the poverty that the Catholic Church only preached. They walked barefoot while bishops rode in carriages. They fasted while priests feasted. How could wealth argue against poverty and win? Cardinal Romano suggested economic pressure. The Church held vast lands throughout Occitania, collected tithes, controlled trade routes. Surely this leverage could force compliance. But the Cardinal had to acknowledge that many of these theoretical possessions were already in the hands of nobles who had simply stopped sending revenues to Rome. The Count of Toulouse, Raymond VI, supposedly a faithful son of the Church, somehow never found the resources to suppress heretics in his lands, or the time to enforce collection of church taxes. The military option lurked unspoken until Bishop Fouquet of Toulouse, recently arrived in Rome, laid it out with brutal clarity. The southern nobles would never act against the Cathars because they benefited from them. Cathar teaching justified seizing church lands, ignoring ecclesiastical courts, and treating Rome's authority as literally satanic. Only outside force could restore order. The same holy war that had been preached against Muslims in the Holy Land could be directed against heretics much closer to home. Innocent was a lawyer by training, a man who believed in the power of proper procedure and legitimate authority. He had reformed the papal administration, codified canon law, and called the Fourth Lateran Council to establish universal church practices. But Occitania resisted all his organizational efforts. Local bishops ignored his summons, monasteries continued their irregular practices, and the Cathar counterchurch grew stronger each year. The Pope decided to try everything simultaneously. He sent his best preachers, including a Spanish canon named Domingo de Guzman, who would later be known as Saint Dominic. He ordered local bishops to reform or be replaced. He threatened nobles with excommunication if they continued protecting heretics. He offered the same indulgences for fighting heretics as for crusading in the Holy Land. And he appointed a series of papal legates with extraordinary powers to investigate, negotiate, and if necessary, prepare for more drastic action. Peter of Castell now became his chief legate to Occitania, a Cistercian monk known for his inflexibility and fierce devotion to papal authority. Peter carried letters giving him power to excommunicate anyone, including counts and bishops, who failed to actively suppress heresy. He could place entire regions under interdict, forbidding all sacraments until compliance was achieved. He was, in effect, the Pope's personal representative, with nearly unlimited spiritual weapons at his disposal. Yet even as Peter set out for Toulouse, Innocent must have known that spiritual weapons only worked on those who feared them. The Cathars denied the validity of excommunication. Many nobles had been excommunicated so often they treated it as a minor inconvenience. The merchants and craftsmen who formed the economic backbone of Occitania were more concerned with trade disruptions than interdicts. The church could threaten damnation, but what if people simply didn't believe the church had the power to damn? The perfect path. Dawn has not yet touched the eastern sky when Brother Pons begins his day with the ritual that has shaped every morning for the past 20 years. He rises from the simple straw pallet in the house where he spent the night, careful not to wake the believing family who sheltered him. His travelling companion, Brother Guillaume, is already awake, sitting in perfect stillness by the window, watching the stars fade. They exchange no words, for this is one of their 3 weekly fast days, when even speech is minimized to preserve energy. The life of a perfect is measured not in years, but in acts of renunciation. When Pons received the consolamentum at age 30, he understood that he was choosing something far more demanding than the monastic life offered by the Catholic Church. Monks might fast periodically, the perfect fast constantly, eating only enough to keep their bodies functioning as vessels for preaching. Monks take vows of poverty, but live in communities that own vast estates. The perfect own literally nothing, not even the black robes they wear, which belong to the community and are passed from one perfect to another as needed. Consider what this means in practical terms. Pons carries no money, for coins are material objects that tie one to the material world. When he needs to travel by boat, he must find a believer willing to pay his passage, or a boatman willing to transport him for God's sake. He cannot eat at public inns, for the food might contain meat, eggs, or dairy products, all forbidden as products of sexual generation. Even vegetables must be carefully selected, for the perfect cannot eat anything that might contain the seeds of new life. Bread, wine, fish, and certain fruits form their entire diet, and even these are taken sparingly. The prohibition against killing extends to all living things. Pons walks carefully, especially in darkness, to avoid stepping on insects. When he finds fleas in his robe, he removes them gently and places them outside rather than crushing them. This might seem extreme, even absurd, but for the perfect it represents a complete rejection of the violence inherent in the material world. Every act of killing, no matter how small, perpetuates the cycles of destruction that keep souls trapped in matter. The sexual abstinence required of the perfect goes beyond the celibacy of Catholic priests, who at least in theory avoid women, but often in practice maintain families. The perfect must avoid not just sexual activity, but any thought or situation that might lead to arousal. They travel in pairs, partly for mutual support, but also for accountability. They avoid looking directly at members of the opposite sex, sleep in separate rooms when possible, and even avoid foods believed to inflame passion. This isn't from hatred of sexuality, but from understanding it as the mechanism through which souls are dragged back into material existence. Pons and Guillaume spend their morning in silent prayer, not the formulaic repetitions of the Catholic Church, but deep meditation on the nature of light and darkness, spirit and matter. They pray for the souls still trapped in bodies, for the believers who support them, even for their persecutors, who know not what they do. Prayer for a perfect is not petition, for what could one ask from the good God, who has already given the spark of divine light? Instead, it is alignment, turning the soul away from material distractions toward its true nature. As the sun rises, the two perfect prepare to continue their journey. They are walking from Toulouse to Carcassonne, a distance of some 60 miles that they will cover in 3 days. They could accept a ride from a believing merchant, but walking serves multiple purposes. It maintains their independence from material convenience, allows them to stop and preach in villages along the way, and demonstrates their commitment to the arduous path they have chosen. Their first stop is a small cluster of houses where a woman lies dying. The believers sent word yesterday, and the perfect have adjusted their route to arrive in time. The consolamentum cannot be rushed or delayed. It must come at the precise moment when the soul is ready to receive it, usually in the final hours of life. Too early, and the recipient might recover and be unable to maintain the strict requirements, losing their consolation. Too late, and the soul departs still bound to the material world, condemned to return in another body. The dying woman has been preparing for weeks, gradually reducing her food intake, making peace with those she has wronged, distributing her possessions among her children. Her husband, not a believer himself but respectful of her faith, has agreed to release her from their marriage vows so she can receive the consolation. This is no small sacrifice, for it means he cannot remarry while she lives, even if she lingers for months, but he loves her enough to grant her the death she desires. The perfect enter the sick room with practiced grace. They have performed this ritual hundreds of times, yet each consolamentum remains unique, shaped by the specific soul preparing for liberation. They speak with the woman, ensuring she understands the commitment she is making. If she recovers, she must live as perfect, or risk damnation worse than if she had never received consolation at all. She nods her understanding, her eyes already focused on something beyond the material world. During the ritual, Pons feels what he always feels at these moments, a thinning of the veil between matter and spirit, a sense that the room fills with invisible presences, that something fundamental shifts in the architecture of reality. The skeptical might dismiss this as suggestion, emotion, or oxygen deprivation from fasting, but for the perfect, it is confirmation that they serve as conduits for genuine spiritual power, the same power that flowed through Christ's apostles. After the consolamentum, the woman's family offers food and payment. The perfect accept only bread and water, and no payment at all. This often frustrates believers who want to support those who have brought such comfort to their loved ones. But the perfect understand that accepting payment would transform them from spiritual guides into merchants of salvation, exactly what they accuse the Catholic Church of becoming, with its sale of indulgences and demanded tithes. Lords of the mountain castles, high above the valley floor, where eagles nest and clouds snag on rocky outcroppings. The castles of Occitania perch like stone birds of prey. But these fortresses, which might elsewhere shelter warriors preparing for battle, have become sanctuaries for those who preach absolute pacifism. The lords who rule from these mountain strongholds have made a choice that defies every expectation of feudal nobility. They protect and promote a faith that condemns the very violence on which their power supposedly rests. Consider Raymond de Perella, Lord of Montségur, whose castle sits more than 3,000 feet above sea level, on a limestone peak that seems designed by nature for defense. Raymond inherited not just stones and lands, but a tradition of religious independence. Reaching back generations, his family had always maintained that their authority came from their ability to protect their people, not from the church's blessing or the French king's recognition. When the Cathars sought refuge, offering no military support, no taxes, no political advantage, Raymond opened his gates without hesitation. The castle of Montségur became more than a fortress. It transformed into a spiritual capital, a vertical city devoted to contemplation and learning. By 1200, over 200, Perfect lived within its walls, far exceeding the normal population of such a remote stronghold. They built wooden houses against the inner walls, created workshops for copying texts, established schools for training new Perfect. The military architecture, designed to withstand sieges, now sheltered those who wouldn't lift a sword, even to defend themselves. The transformation of these military spaces into spiritual ones reflected a deeper change in how the southern nobility understood power and authority. In northern France, the emerging code of chivalry emphasized military prowess in service to the church. A good lord was one who could field cavalry, maintain order through force, and lead crusades against infidels. But in Occitania, influenced by troubadour culture and Cathar teaching, a different ideal emerged. The lord as protector of diversity, patron of arts and learning, defender of those who chose different paths to God. The noble women of these mountain castles played crucial roles that would have been impossible in the north. Corba de Perella, Raymond's wife, effectively governed Montségur while her husband managed military defences. She organised supplies for hundreds of Perfect, mediated disputes, managed correspondence with other Cathar centres. She created what witnesses described as an atmosphere of profound peace within walls, originally built for war. Her daughters, Arpace and Philippa, received education equal to any noble's son, learning to read not just Occitan but Latin, studying theology, with the Perfect, developing their own understanding of spiritual matters. These castle communities developed unique economies that balanced material necessity with spiritual principle. The Perfect couldn't handle money or own property, but the castles needed supplies. Noble believers served as intermediaries, using their wealth to purchase what was needed, then offering it freely to the Perfect. Craftsman believers would work within the castle walls, their labour considered a form of prayer. The result was something between a monastery and a commune, neither fully religious nor fully secular. The protection these nobles offered came at increasing cost as the Catholic Church grew more aggressive in its demands for suppression of heresy. Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, found himself caught between his role as theoretical defender of the Church and his actual sympathy for the Cathars. His vassals openly protected Perfect, his own family members had received the consolamentum, and his court was full of troubadours who mocked the corruption of Roman clergy. Yet he was the highest-ranking noble in the region, repeatedly pressured by Pope Innocent III to act against heretics. The Count's response was a masterpiece of medieval political ambiguity. He would promise action, then claim inability to identify heretics, since they looked just like good Christians. He would authorize investigations, then ensure the investigators never quite reached the right castles at the right times. He would express shock at the spread of heresy, while his own officials provided Perfect with travel documents. This delicate balance required constant negotiation, generous bribes to papal legates, and an intricate network of informants to warn of impending church action. The debate at Montreal, in the Great Hall of Montreal Castle, near Carcassonne, in the summer of 1207, two worldviews collided in what would be remembered as one of the last attempts to resolve the Cathar crisis through words rather than swords. The debate had been arranged by Pierre de Castelnau, the papal legate who believed that superior Catholic theology would triumph over Cathar error if properly presented. Facing him were Guy l'Abbé de Castras, the Cathar Bishop of Toulouse, and several other Perfect, ready to defend their understanding of Christianity before an audience of nobles, merchants, and clergy from both faiths. The Spanish canon Domingo de Guzman, who would later found the Dominican order, served as the primary Catholic disputant. Domingo had spent months preparing, studying not just Catholic theology but the specific arguments of the Cathars, learning their favourite scriptural passages, anticipating their objections. He arrived not in the magnificent robes of a church dignitary, but in simple wool, barefoot like the perfect themselves, hoping to show that Catholics too could embrace apostolic poverty. The question under debate seemed simple. Was the material world created by the good God or by an evil power? But this single question contained within it the entire structure of Christian belief. If matter was good, then the incarnation made sense, the sacraments were valid, and the Catholic Church's material wealth could be justified. If matter was evil, then Christ never truly became flesh. The sacraments were meaningless, and the Church itself was an agent of darkness. Guilabert opened with the problem of evil, that ancient challenge to omnipotent benevolence. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why do innocents suffer? Why do children die in agony? Why do earthquakes swallow villages and plagues devastate populations? The Catholic answer, that evil resulted from human free will and original sin, failed to explain natural disasters or the suffering of animals. Only the existence of an evil creator, Guilabert argued, could explain the fundamental cruelty built into the natural world. Domingo responded with Augustine's arguments about evil as the absence of good, rather than a positive force. But Guilabert was ready. Absence cannot cause positive suffering. Darkness doesn't actively hurt, it merely lacks light. But pain is not merely the absence of pleasure. It is an active, positive experience that requires a positive cause. The God who designed bodies capable of feeling such exquisite agonies cannot be the same God whom Christ called the loving Father. The debate continued for hours, then days, with breaks for meals and prayer. The audience, initially excited by the spectacle, grew increasingly thoughtful as they witnessed not the simple triumph of truth over error that each side had promised, but the genuine difficulty of these questions. When Domingo quoted scripture, Guilabert quoted different passages. When Guilabert pointed to logical contradictions, Domingo offered sophisticated philosophical distinctions. Neither side was obviously wrong or obviously right. Sunlight through stone. Morning arrives at Montségur, as it has for countless centuries, with fingers of light reaching through the eastern windows, painting geometric patterns on stone floors, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. The castle sits so high that it catches the sun before the valleys below have emerged from shadow, an island of light floating above a sea of mist. In the chapel, though the Cathars would never call it that, preferring simply the meeting room, the light has special significance. The perfect have gathered for their dawn contemplation, sitting in silent meditation as the sunbeams slowly traverse the floor. They built this room with careful attention to the sun's path, windows placed to capture specific angles at significant times. Not for worship of the sun itself, but as a reminder that light, immaterial and pure, can enter the material world without being contaminated by it. And that's the stones themselves tell stories in this morning light. Here, the marks of the masons who shaped them 800 years ago. There, the slight depression where countless knees have knelt. The walls hold the warmth of yesterday's sun and release it slowly through the cool mountain night. A gentle circulation of energy that the perfect sea is metaphor for the soul's journey through matter back to spirit. A cat stretches in a puddle of sunlight, that mysterious creature that the mountain castle tolerates for its war on mice, but never truly owns. The perfect watch it, with something approaching envy. The cat lives purely in the moment, without the burden of consciousness that makes humans aware of their imprisonment. It kills without malice, sleeps without guilt, exists without questioning existence. Perhaps this is why the Cathars believe animal souls are different from human souls, not fallen spirits, but part of the material world's natural machinery. The light moves and shadows shift, and somewhere below in the valley, church bells call Catholics to Mass. But here on the mountain, time moves differently, measured not in canonical hours but in the slow progression of seasons, the even slower progression of souls toward enlightenment. Children of two worlds. Young Pierre Morand lives between realms, though at 12 years old, he doesn't fully understand the precarious nature of his position. His mother is a devoted believer who has already declared her intention to receive the consolamentum when her children are grown. His father maintains the family's Catholic facade, attending Mass regularly and contributing to the local church's upkeep. At home, Pierre navigates these contradictions with the adaptability that children possess when their survival depends on reading adult moods and expectations. On Sundays, Pierre stands beside his father in the church of Saint-Senin, reciting Latin prayers he has memorized without understanding. The priest, Father André, speaks of hellfire and damnation, of the torments awaiting heretics, while Pierre's mind wanders to the perfect who visited their home last week. Those gentle men in black robes who refused even his mother's honey cakes because honey came from the labor of imprisoned bees. They spoke of salvation for all souls eventually. No eternal damnation, just the long journey home to light. The contradiction creates a peculiar double consciousness in children like Pierre. They learn early to speak differently in different spaces, to recognize who can be trusted with which truths. When the neighbor asks why his mother wasn't at Mass, Pierre knows to mention her recurring illness, the weakness that confines her to bed. He doesn't mention that she spends those Sunday mornings in prayer and study with other believing women, reading from hidden texts, discussing the nature of the soul. At school, run by the Cathedral chapter, Pierre excels at his lessons precisely because he has already learned to read at home. His mother taught him using the Occitan translation of John's Gospel, tracing the letters with her finger, explaining how the Word was God, and God was light, and light could never be contained by darkness. But when Brother Martin praises his quick learning of Latin prayers, Pierre knows to credit only the excellence of Catholic instruction, never revealing his prior education. The burden of secrecy shapes these children in profound ways. They cannot form easy friendships, never knowing which playmate might innocently repeat something that could bring the inquisitors. They watch their parents for signs of tension, learning to recognize when silence is safer than questions. They develop elaborate mental architectures to keep their various worlds separate, exhausting psychological work for minds that should be free to wonder and explore. Yet there are compensations in this divided life. These children often develop exceptional intellectual flexibility, the ability to see questions from multiple perspectives, to understand that truth might be more complex than any single doctrine can contain. They learn languages quickly, moving between Occitan at home, Latin at church, and sometimes French with northern merchants. They become skilled at reading social situations, understanding power dynamics, recognizing the difference between what people say and what they mean. Pierre's older sister, Guillerma, has already made her choice. At 16, she has declared her intention to receive the consolamentum and become a perfect. Their father raged, threatened to lock her in a convent, to disown her, to beat the heresy out of her. But their mother stood firm, and in Occitania, a mother's spiritual authority in the household carries weight. Guillerma now lives with other young women, preparing for the perfect life, learning the disciplines of fasting, memorizing scripture, practicing the austere life she will lead. The economic implications of these divided families are considerable. Catholic law states that heretics forfeit all property rights, their goods subject to confiscation. But determining who is a heretic requires investigation, trial, and conviction, processes that local authorities are reluctant to pursue against their neighbours. So families develop complex strategies to protect their wealth. Property is transferred to Catholic relatives, held in trust for children, hidden through false sales and secret agreements. Pierre's father, despite his anger at his daughter's choice, has quietly transferred ownership of their vineyards to his brother, a man whose Catholic orthodoxy is beyond question, but who happens to be married to a Cathar believer. The income from the vineyards still flows to Pierre's family, but legally, they own nothing that could be confiscated. These arrangements require absolute trust between family members and create their own webs of obligation and dependency. The children absorb these lessons in survival, understanding that principles matter, but so does pragmatism. They learn that truth can be dangerous, that love sometimes requires deception, that protecting those you care about might mean betraying abstract ideals. These are not easy lessons for young minds, and many children raised in such households carry lifelong anxieties, always waiting for the knock at the door, the accusation, the moment when their careful constructions collapse. The legate's blood. The morning of January 14th, 1208, began like many others for Pierre de Castelnau, papal legate to Occitania. He had spent the night at the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Gilles after another frustrating encounter with Count Raymond VI of Toulouse. The Count had promised, yet again, to take action against heretics. He had sworn, yet again, that he was a faithful son of the Church, and Pierre knew, with the certainty of repeated disappointment, that nothing would change. Pierre was not a patient man by nature, and 3 years of dealing with Occitan nobility had exhausted what little forbearance he possessed. He had excommunicated the Count twice, lifted the ban twice upon receiving promises of reform, and watched those promises evaporate like morning dew. The previous day's meeting had ended with Pierre declaring that he would return to Rome and recommend that the Pope call a crusade against the Count and all who sheltered heretics. Raymond had responded with words that witnesses would later dispute, some claiming he threatened the legate directly, others that he merely expressed frustration at ecclesiastical interference. As Pierre prepared to board the ferry that would carry him across the Rhône, beginning his journey back to Rome, a knight approached from behind. The man was later identified as someone from Raymond's retinue, though his exact identity would remain disputed. Without warning, without even offering Pierre a chance to defend himself, the knight drove his lance through the legate's back. Pierre fell forward, blood spreading across his white Cistercian robes, in a pattern that witnesses would compare to the wings of an angel, though such poetic descriptions came only later, after the shock had faded and the implications had become clear. He lived long enough to forgive his attacker, a detail that would be emphasized in every Catholic account, transforming Pierre from a rigid bureaucrat into a Christian martyr. He died as the ferryman tried desperately to stop the bleeding, his last words reportedly being, "May God forgive you, as I forgive you." The assassination changed everything. For years, the Church had struggled to generate enthusiasm for action against the Cathars. Northern nobles saw no profit in attacking fellow Christians, who posed no military threat. Common people couldn't understand why these austere preachers deserved death, when corrupt priests walked free. But the murder of a papal legate, a direct representative of the Pope, struck at the very heart of church authority. If legates could be killed with impunity, then Rome's power meant nothing. Pope Innocent III received the news while celebrating Mass in the Lateran Basilica. Witnesses reported that he stopped mid-prayer, his face transforming from shock to grief, to what one cardinal described as righteous fury contained within iron control. The Pope withdrew to his chambers and emerged 3 days later with a series of letters that would unleash forces beyond anyone's ability to control. To King Philip Augustus of France, Innocent wrote that the murder of Pierre de Castelnau was not just an attack on the Church, but on the very principle of divine authority. Those who sheltered heretics had revealed themselves as enemies of God. The Pope offered the same spiritual rewards for fighting heretics in Occitania as for fighting Muslims in the Holy Land: complete remission of sins, protection of property while on crusade, and the promise of lands seized from heretics. This last provision was crucial, The northern French nobility had been struggling with a problem of too many sons and not enough land. The custom of primogeniture meant younger sons inherited nothing, forcing them to seek their fortunes through marriage, the church, or military adventure. The Occitan lands, wealthy from trade and agriculture, ruled by nobles who protected heretics, now became legitimate targets for conquest in God's name. Count Raymond VI, realizing the catastrophe approaching, immediately proclaimed his innocence. He had not ordered the assassination, he swore. The knight had acted alone, motivated by personal grievance, or perhaps even Cathar manipulation to discredit the count. Raymond offered to undergo any penance, to submit to any investigation, to provide any proof of his orthodoxy. But it was too late. The murder had provided exactly the catalyst innocent needed to justify what diplomacy had failed to accomplish. The propaganda campaign that followed transformed Pierre de Castelnau from a frustrated church bureaucrat into a holy martyr. Miracles were attributed to his tomb. His rigid inflexibility became principled devotion. His threats against local nobility became prophecies of divine justice. Songs were composed about his martyrdom, spreading through northern France, each verse emphasizing the evil of those who had killed God's representative. Arnold Amalric, the abbot of Quito, was appointed to lead the spiritual side of the coming crusade. Unlike Pierre, Arnold understood that this was not really about theology, but about power. The Cathar heresy provided justification, but the real goal was to bring Occitania under the direct control of the French crown and Roman Church. In his letters to potential crusaders, Arnold emphasized not the doctrinal errors of the Cathars, but the wealth of the southern lands, the weakness of their divided nobility, the opportunity for glory and profit. The assassination also changed how the Cathars themselves were perceived. Previously, they had been seen as misguided but harmless, their pacifism making them objects of pity or contempt rather than fear. But now they were associated with murder, even though no Cathar had held the lance, even though their doctrine forbade all violence. The complexity of Occitan politics, where Catholic nobles protected Cathar, perfect for various reasons, was simplified into a stark narrative. The heretics had killed God's representative, and they must be destroyed. You feel the ground tremble. You stand on the walls of Béziers on a July morning in 1209, and you feel the ground tremble. It's not an earthquake, though your mind briefly offers that comfortable explanation. It's the synchronized march of 20,000 men approaching from the north, the largest army assembled in Christendom since the Second Crusade. The vibration travels through the stones beneath your feet, up through your legs, settling in your stomach as a sick certainty that your world is about to end. The city below you continues its morning routines with desperate normalcy. Bakers pull bread from ovens, their familiar shouts calling customers to buy while the loaves are warm. Children play in the narrow streets, their laughter sharp and bright against the growing rumble. Women draw water from wells, their conversations deliberately avoiding what everyone knows approaches. The cathedral bells ring the hour, as they have every morning for centuries, as if routine could ward off catastrophe. You can see them now, the crusaders, cresting the distant hills like a dark wave. The morning sun catches on metal, 10,000 points of light that should be beautiful, but instead feel like the eyes of predators. Banners ripple above the mass of men, displaying the crosses and saints of northern France, declaring this slaughter a holy mission. You recognize some of the heraldry: Simon de Montfort's lion, the lilies of France, the crosses of a dozen bishops who have come to watch heresy burn. Your own legs shake, and it's not from the trembling ground but from the knowledge of what you've hidden. In your house, beneath the floorboards of your workshop, are the Occitan Gospels that your grandmother gave you before she received the Consolamentum. In your memory are the faces of perfect, who have shared your table, blessed your children, comforted your dying father. You are not a Cathar yourself. You still attend Mass, still take communion, but you have never betrayed those who seek God differently. The city's bells begin to ring differently now, not the steady count of hours, but the frantic clanging of alarm. Too late, far too late. The consuls of Béziers had days of warning, but chose to believe that negotiation was still possible, that the rules of warfare between Christians would protect them. They offered to surrender the known Cathars, all 200 of them, according to the list prepared by the bishop. The Crusaders' response was simple: surrender the entire city or face the consequences. You watch the city's militia gather in the square below, maybe 3,000 men, many of them craftsmen who have barely held a sword. They wear bits and pieces of armor, family heirlooms, or hastily purchased protection that won't stop a crossbow bolt or a cavalry charge. Some are your neighbors: the wool merchant whose daughter plays with yours, the blacksmith who repaired your tools last week, the vineyard owner who always saves his best wine for friends. They're going to die. You all know it. But what else can they do? The sound changes as the Crusader army stops just beyond arrow range. 20,000 throats begin to sing, a Latin hymn that carries across the morning air. Veni, Creator Spiritus, invoking the Holy Spirit to bless their coming slaughter. You don't understand Latin, but you recognize the melody from high masses, and the perversion of it, the use of sacred music to sanctify murder, makes bile rise in your throat. Pope Innocent's Holy War. In Rome, Pope Innocent III stood before the assembled cardinals and delivered the sermon that would transform the suppression of heresy into holy war. The date was November 10th, 1208, and the Pope's words were carefully chosen to accomplish what years of threats and negotiations had failed to achieve: mobilize the military might of northern France against the Cathars of Occitania. The ship of Street Peter, Innocent declared, his voice carrying through the vast hall of the Lateran, is threatened not by Saracens across the sea, but by heretics within our very borders. These Cathars are worse than Muslims, for the infidel never knew Christ while the heretic has known him and rejected him. They are a cancer in the body of Christendom, and like surgeons guided by divine wisdom, we must cut out this disease before it spreads to destroy us all. The theological justification for crusade had always been complex. Augustine had developed the concept of just war, but killing fellow Christians required additional mental gymnastics. Innocent solved this by declaring that heretics, by virtue of their heresy, had removed themselves from the body of Christ. They were no longer Christians but enemies of Christianity, and thus legitimate targets for holy war. Moreover, those who protected heretics, regardless of their own orthodoxy, became contaminated by association and equally deserving of divine punishment. The Pope's innovation was to offer the same spiritual rewards for fighting heretics as for fighting in the Holy Land, but with significant practical advantages. The journey to Occitania was weeks rather than months. The climate was familiar rather than foreign. The enemy was militarily weak rather than strong. And most importantly, the lands seized from heretics could be kept by those who seized them, rather than being held in trust for Christendom as in the East. The financial arrangements Innocent crafted were masterful in their manipulation of feudal obligations. Crusaders' debts were suspended for the duration of their service. Their lands were placed under papal protection, immune from legal challenges. They could tax their own vassals to fund their participation, and any wealth seized from heretics was theirs to keep, minus a reasonable donation to the church. For indebted northern nobles, this was not just spiritual opportunity, but economic salvation. The response exceeded even Innocent's expectations. By spring of 1209, armies were gathering across northern France: the Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Nevers, the Count of St. Pol, and dozens of lesser nobles declared their intention to take the cross against heretics. Even more significantly, thousands of common soldiers, mercenaries, and simple adventurers joined the cause. These routiers, as they were called, were motivated less by salvation than by the promise of plunder. But their military experience would prove crucial. The Northerners descend. Simon de Montfort stood on a hill overlooking the assembled Crusader army and felt the intoxicating mixture of religious fervour and military ambition that would drive him. For the next decade, a minor noble from the Ile de France, Simon owned a modest estate that generated barely enough income to maintain his status. But here, at the head of an army sanctioned by God, he saw opportunity to become something more, a new Charlemagne, bringing both spiritual and temporal order to the chaotic south. Simon was 44 years old, an experienced soldier who had fought in the Fourth Crusade before becoming disgusted with its diversion to Constantinople. He was genuinely devout, hearing Mass daily, fasting regularly, consulting with priests before every military decision. But he was also ruthlessly practical, understanding that fear was often more effective than faith in achieving submission. His combination of rigid piety and tactical brilliance would make him the most effective and most hated figure of the Albigensian Crusade. The army that descended toward Occitania in June 1209 was unlike anything the South had seen. Northern warfare had evolved differently, emphasizing heavy cavalry, siege engines, and coordinated tactics. The Southern nobles, with their small retinues and fortified positions, were prepared for limited conflicts over specific disputes. They were not prepared for total war aimed at complete subjugation. The cultural disconnect between North and South became apparent immediately. The Crusaders were shocked by what they saw as the lax morality of Occitania. Women who spoke freely in public, nobles who socialized with merchants and Jews, priests who lived openly with families. To the Northerners, raised in a more rigid social structure, this all confirmed the corruption that heresy had wrought. The sophistication that Occitans saw as civilization, the Crusaders saw as decadence, deserving destruction. The first major target was Béziers, chosen not because it was a Cathar stronghold, but because it refused to surrender its Cathar citizens. The city was actually predominantly Catholic, with perhaps 200 known Cathars among a population of 20,000. But the principle of collective responsibility had been established. Those who protected heretics shared their guilt. When the city consuls offered to identify and surrender the Cathars, Arnold Amalric, the papal legate, refused. The entire city must submit or face consequences. What followed would become the most infamous atrocity of the Albigensian Crusade, though far from the last. Béziers, kill them all. The attack on Béziers began almost by accident. On July 22nd, 1209, the Crusader army had settled in for what they expected would be a lengthy siege when a group of routiers, the irregular soldiers who followed the army for plunder, decided to probe the city's defences. These weren't knights seeking glory, but professional killers seeking profit. Men who had learned their trade in the constant small wars that plagued France. A sortie from the city, young men more brave than wise, rushed out to drive off what they thought was a minor raid. But the routiers were veterans who knew how to turn a small advantage into a rout. They followed the retreating defenders right through the open gates before the city's guards could close them. Within minutes, what should have been a siege lasting weeks became a massacre measured in hours. The Crusader knights, seeing the routiers streaming into the city, faced a choice. They could maintain discipline, wait for orders, allow the siege to proceed according to the rules of war, or they could join the slaughter and claim their share of glory and plunder. The choice was made in moments. 20,000 armed men poured through Béziers' gates like water through a broken dam. The killing began in the streets nearest the gates. The city's militia, those 3,000 craftsmen and merchants who had prepared to defend their walls, were cut down before they could organize resistance. The narrow streets that should have favored defenders became death traps as panic-stricken civilians fled toward the perceived safety of churches. The Crusaders followed, their religious mission forgotten in the frenzy of slaughter. The Cathedral of Saint-Nazaire became the scene of the most concentrated horror. 7,000 civilians, perhaps more, had sought sanctuary within its walls. Under the traditional laws of war, churches were inviolate, and those who sought sanctuary there were protected. But Arnold Amalric, the papal legate, had already provided the words that would echo through history. When asked how to distinguish Catholics from Cathars, he reportedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Whether Arnold actually spoke these words, or they were attributed to him later, they captured the essential logic of the massacre. If God was omnipotent and just, then he would ensure that innocent Catholics who died would go to heaven, while guilty Cathars would go to hell. Human judgment was unnecessary when divine judgment was perfect. This theological rationalization transformed mass murder into an act of faith. The doors of the cathedral were broken down. What happened next was recorded by both Crusader chroniclers who tried to justify it, and Occitan survivors who could barely describe it. Men, women, and children were slaughtered without distinction. Priests were killed at their altars. Babies were thrown against walls. The blood, witnesses said, ran so deep that men slipped in it as they continued their killing. The cathedral bells rang continuously, not calling for help that would never come, but simply because dying hands clutched the bell ropes in their final spasms. When the killing inside the churches finally ended, the looting began. But Béziers was a wealthy city, and disputes quickly arose over the division of plunder. The solution was breathtakingly simple: burn everything. If the Crusaders couldn't agree on who owned what, then no one would own anything. The fires started in the wooden buildings near the cathedral and spread quickly in the July heat. Those who had hidden in cellars and attics were burned alive. The stone buildings that didn't burn had their roofs collapse from the heat, crushing anyone sheltered within. The speed and totality of the destruction shocked even veteran soldiers. Cities might be sacked, but usually there was method to it. Preservation of valuable property for the victors. But Béziers was annihilated with a thoroughness that suggested not military strategy, but divine wrath made manifest. By nightfall, where a city of 20,000 had stood that morning, only smoking ruins remained. The death toll was disputed even at the time. Arnold Amalric, writing to Pope Innocent III, claimed 20,000 dead. Other sources suggested 15,000. Modern historians, noting the city's population and the likelihood of some escapes, estimate between 7 and 10,000, but the exact number matters less than the message it sent. This was not war as Occitania had known it. This was extermination. The psychological impact spread faster than any army could march. Within days, every city and castle in Languedoc knew what had happened at Béziers. The Crusaders had demonstrated that they would show no mercy, honour no sanctuary, follow no rules. Towns that might have resisted instead surrendered immediately. Narbonne submitted without a fight. Carcassonne, despite its formidable defences, negotiated surrender after a brief siege. The lesson of Béziers was clear. Resistance meant annihilation. For the Cathars, Béziers represented something even more profound than military defeat. Here was proof, written in blood and ash, that the material world was indeed the kingdom of evil. The Catholic Church, claiming to represent the God of love, had sanctioned the murder of thousands of innocents. The perfect who had preached that Rome served the dark creator seemed vindicated in the most horrible way possible. The siege lines tighten. Inside Carcassonne, August 1209, Marie watches her 5-year-old son grow weaker with each passing day. The siege has lasted 2 weeks, and the Crusaders have done something the city's defenders never anticipated. They've poisoned the water supply by throwing corpses of animals, maybe even humans, into the river upstream. The wells within the walls now bring up water that smells of death, and those who drink it are seized with flux that drains their strength within hours. Her husband, a sergeant in the city militia, hasn't been home in 3 days. He mans the walls where Crusader catapults throw not just stones but the heads of captured scouts. A psychological warfare that breaks spirits faster than stones break walls. Marie doesn't tell him about their son's illness when he sends messages. He has enough burdens. She doesn't tell him that she's been attending the Cathar prayer meetings in the weaver's house, finding more comfort in their promise of eventual escape from this hell than in the priest's assurances that God will protect the righteous. The nobility are already negotiating surrender. Viscount Raymond Roger Trencavel, young and idealistic, had sworn to protect all his subjects regardless of faith. But now, faced with the reality of his dying city, he's being forced to choose between honour and survival. The Crusaders offer terms. The city will be spared if the Cathars are surrendered and the Viscount becomes a prisoner. It's not really a choice at all. Marie bundles her son in the last clean blanket she can find and makes her way through streets that grow more desperate each day. Dead animals lie where they fell, no one having energy to move them. The cathedral is full of dying refugees from the countryside who fled here seeking safety. The irony is bitter, seeking protection in stone walls when the real danger flows in the water, invisible and inexorable. At the weaver's house, 2 perfects sit with the dying, offering the consolamentum to any who request it. Marie considers asking for it for her son, but he's too young to understand the commitments involved, too delirious with fever to consent. She holds him while one of the perfect, a woman named Dulcia, who once blessed Marie's wedding, despite it being a Catholic ceremony, sings softly in Occitan. It's not a Cathar hymn, but an old lullaby about swallows returning home, and for a moment, the dying child's breathing eases. Tomorrow, the city will surrender. The Viscount will give himself as hostage to save his people. He'll die in a Crusader dungeon within 3 months, officially of illness, probably of murder. Simon de Montfort will claim the city and its territories, the beginning of his southern empire. And Marie, if she survives the fever that's already burning in her own body, will have to decide whether to pretend conversion or join the streams of refugees fleeing toward the mountains, where the perfect promise that resistance, spiritual if not military, will continue. Songs, silenced. The last troubadour of the Château de l'Aurac sings his final song as Crusader soldiers pile wood around the stake where he stands bound. His name was Aymeric, though the Crusaders who condemned him didn't bother recording it. They only noted a maker of heretical songs in their brief trial records. His crime was not being a Cathar, for he had never received a consolamentum, but composing verses that mocked the church's wealth and celebrated the beauty of a world that didn't require priests to interpret God's will. The tradition of the troubadours, that glorious flowering of vernacular poetry and song that had made Occitania the cultural beacon of Europe, was dying along with everything else the Crusaders touched. These weren't just entertainers, but the carriers of an entire worldview that celebrated earthly love as a path to spiritual enlightenment, that recognized women as worthy of devotion and capable of judgment, that found the divine in human emotion rather than ecclesiastical doctrine. The Crusaders understood, with the instinctive recognition that cultural warriors possess, that these songs were as dangerous as any Cathar preaching. A verse that praised a lady's wisdom, challenged patriarchal hierarchy. A melody that found God in nature, undermined church authority. A poem that celebrated choosing love over duty, questioned the entire feudal order that the northern nobles enforced. The troubadours had to be silenced not just because they supported heretics, but because they represented an alternative vision of what Christian civilization could be. As the flames rise around Aymeric, he sings not a plea for mercy or a prayer for salvation, but one of the ancient songs of his land, about the lark that rises singing into the sun, even as its wings burn. His voice, trained through decades of performance, carries over the crackling wood and the jeers of soldiers. Other prisoners, Cathars awaiting their own executions, take up the melody, humming when they don't know the words. For a few minutes, the courtyard of Languedoc fills with music that speaks of beauty and transcendence, even in the face of annihilation. The song dies with the singer, but its silence echoes. Within a generation, the troubadour tradition will effectively end in Occitania. Its practitioners fled to Spain or Italy, its language suppressed in favour of Northern French. Its revolutionary idea that love could exist outside the Church's sacraments, buried under orthodox doctrine. Raymond's humiliation. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse stood naked to the waist in front of the Cathedral of St. Gilles on June 18, 1209, the most powerful noble in Occitania, theoretical lord of territories larger than the French king's direct holdings, had been reduced to this public humiliation as the price for maintaining any authority at all. Around his neck hung a rope, symbol of his spiritual bondage, held by the papal legate who would lead him like an animal into the church. The ceremony had been carefully orchestrated for maximum degradation. Raymond had to swear, before assembled crowds of his own subjects and northern crusaders, that he had been guilty of heresy, of protecting heretics, of the murder of Pierre de Castelnau, though he continued to protest innocence of this last charge. He had to promise to surrender 7 castles to the church, to serve personally in the crusade against his own vassals, to submit all his territories to ecclesiastical investigation. The physical scourging came next. As Raymond was led through the cathedral, monks lined the path with leather whips, striking his bare back with each step. The blows were symbolic rather than severe, but the humiliation was complete. The count, who had negotiated with kings and emperors as an equal, was being whipped like a common criminal, his blood spotting the cathedral floor that his ancestors had helped build. The political calculation behind Raymond's submission was complex. He had seen what happened to those who resisted the crusade. Better to lose honour than everything. By submitting to the church, he technically became a crusader himself, which meant his lands were under papal protection and couldn't be seized. He could maintain his position by helping destroy his own vassals, preserving the centre of his power by sacrificing the periphery, but the psychological cost was enormous. Raymond had been raised in the tradition of Occitan independence, the idea that southern nobles were partners with the church rather than its servants. To kneel before northern prelates, to accept foreign soldiers on his lands, to participate in destroying the very culture that had nurtured him, created a spiritual wound that would never heal. Contemporary accounts describe him as a changed man after the ceremony, aged decades in minutes, his famous charm replaced by a bitter resignation. The common people of Toulouse watched their count's humiliation with a mixture of contempt and sympathy. Some saw it as just punishment for his failure to protect them. Others recognized it as a pragmatic surrender to overwhelming force. But all understood that if the Count of Toulouse could be reduced to this, then no one in Occitania was safe from the church's power. The traditional relationships between lord and subject, based on mutual obligation and regional identity, were being replaced by something harder and more foreign: absolute submission to Rome's authority. Montségur, the synagogue of Satan. The siege of Montségur began in May 1243, but in many ways it was the culmination of 40 years of resistance, the last stand of a faith that refused to die despite decades of persecution. The castle, perched on its impossible peak, had become more than a fortress. It was a symbol, a shrine, the place where Cathar Christianity made its final claim to legitimacy against the overwhelming might of Catholic orthodoxy. Pierre Amiel, the Archbishop of Narbonne, called it the synagogue of Satan, a phrase that revealed more about Catholic anxieties than Cathar realities. The comparison to a synagogue was deliberate, linking the Cathars to Jews in the medieval mind, both groups that challenged Christian orthodoxy by their very existence. The Satan reference transformed the perfect from misguided Christians into active agents of evil, justifying any measures taken against them. By 1243, the Cathar Church had been driven almost entirely underground. The Inquisition, established specifically to root out heresy, had been operating for over a decade with terrifying efficiency. Thousands had been burned, thousands more imprisoned, entire communities destroyed. Yet Montsegur remained, a vertical city where over 200 perfect continued their ministry, where the Cathar Bishop of Toulouse maintained his seat, where believers still came seeking the consolamentum, despite the mortal danger of the journey. The royal seneschal, Hugues des Arquis, commanded 10,000 men for the siege, an enormous force to deploy against a castle that held fewer than 500 defenders, most of them non-combatants. But Montsegur's position made conventional assault almost impossible. The only approach was up a steep path so narrow that 2 men couldn't walk abreast. The defenders could hold off armies with a handful of soldiers and well-placed stones, so the siege became a waiting game. The Crusaders established camps on every approach, cutting off supplies, building their own fortifications to prevent relief forces from reaching the castle. They hired Basque mountain climbers, men who could scale cliffs that trained soldiers wouldn't attempt, to establish positions on neighbouring peaks from which catapults could finally reach the castle walls. Inside Montségur, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Food supplies, carefully husbanded, could last months, but not forever. Water came from cisterns that depended on rain, and the summer of 1243 was dry. The perfect continued their routines of prayer and fasting, their calm acceptance of approaching death, both inspiring and terrifying the soldiers tasked with defending them. The most remarkable aspect of the siege was what didn't happen. The perfect had numerous opportunities to escape. Mountain guides, who knew secret paths, offered to lead them to safety in Lombardy or Aragon, where Cathars still found protection. But the perfect refused, understanding that their deaths would be their final sermon, their ultimate rejection of the material world and its violence. In January 1244, Basque climbers finally scaled the eastern cliff face at night, establishing a foothold that allowed the Crusaders to position catapults close enough to effectively bombard the castle. The walls that had stood for centuries began to crumble. The garrison commander, Pierre-Roger de Mirepoix, negotiated surrender terms. The soldiers, and other non-Cathars, would be allowed to leave after confessing their sins to Catholic priests. The perfect would have 2 weeks to prepare for their fate. Those 2 weeks became a period of extraordinary spiritual intensity. Many of the garrison, soldiers who had fought for pay rather than faith, chose to receive the consolamentum, knowing it meant certain death. They included Pierre-Roger's own mother and daughter. When asked why they would choose death when life was offered, they replied that after witnessing the perfect's courage and serenity, they could no longer doubt which faith offered true salvation. Number, walking into the flames. The morning of March 16th, 1244, dawned clear and cold over Montségur. 225 perfects stood in the castle's courtyard, their black robes stirring in the mountain wind. They had spent the previous night in prayer and consolamentum, preparing not for death, which was merely the liberation of the soul from its material prison, but for their final testimony to the truth they had lived. The Crusaders had built the pyre in a field below the castle, a massive structure of wooden stakes and platforms designed to burn efficiently, even in the morning dampness. They had learned through terrible practice that green wood burned too slowly, that bodies packed too closely smothered the flames, that the spectacle of execution required careful engineering to achieve its full effect. The soldiers who built it worked in silence, many of them disturbed by what they were about to witness, even if they believed it necessary. Pierre-Roger de Mirepoix, the garrison commander who had negotiated the surrender, watched from the castle walls as the perfect began their descent. His mother and daughter walked among them, having received the consolamentum in those final 2 weeks. He had begged them to recant, to say whatever words the Catholics required, to live, but they had looked at him with such peaceful certainty that his words died unspoken. They understood something he didn't, saw something beyond the approaching flames that made death irrelevant. The procession moved slowly down the mountain path, not from fear or reluctance, but because many of the perfect were elderly or weakened from decades of fasting. They supported each other, the stronger helping the weaker, maintaining the partnerships that had defined their ministry. They sang as they walked, not hymns of sorrow but songs of homecoming, melodies in Occitan that spoke of light returning to light, of the soul's joy at approaching freedom. Among them walked Esclarmonde de Perella, daughter of the castle's lord. Barely 20 years old, she had received the consolamentum as a child and lived her entire life as a perfect, never knowing the compromises that most believers made with the material world. Witnesses would later report that she seemed to glow with an inner light, though whether this was metaphor or something more, the terrified observers couldn't say. The Catholic bishops and inquisitors waited at the pyre, expecting scenes of recantation, pleas for mercy, the breakdown of heretical resolve in the face of agonizing death. They had prepared documents for any who might renounce their errors, ready to commute death sentences to life imprisonment for those who acknowledged Catholic truth. But not one of the 225 asked for mercy. Not one renounced their faith. They walked into the field of execution as if walking into a garden. The ritual of execution required that each condemned be given a final chance to recant. One by one, the inquisitors asked, "Do you renounce the heretical beliefs of the Cathars and embrace the true faith of the Holy Catholic Church?" 225 times, the answer was the same. "I hold to the truth that the good God is pure spirit and has never touched the evil of the material world." Some added personal testimony, forgiving their executioners, expressing joy at their coming liberation, promising that the light would ultimately triumph over darkness. When the formal offers of mercy were complete, the perfect were led to the pyre. They had to be helped up the wooden platforms, many too weak to climb unassisted. The soldiers tasked with binding them to the stakes found their prisoners cooperating, positioning themselves to make the binding easier, some even helping to arrange the wood for more efficient burning. This unexpected cooperation disturbed the executioners more than resistance would have. These people were not acting like victims, but like participants in a ritual they had chosen. As the torches were brought forward, the perfect began their final prayer, spoken in unison with voices that carried across the field to where hundreds watched in mandatory attendance. "Holy Father, God of the good, you who never lie or deceive, who never err or doubt, grant us to know what you know and love what you love, for we are not of this world, and this world is not of us, and we fear to meet death in this realm of an alien god." The flames caught quickly, the carefully dried wood and oil-soaked straw creating an inferno within minutes. But even as the fire rose, the singing continued. Not screams of agony, but hymns of release, voices joining and falling away as the smoke thickened, until finally only silence remained. The entire execution, from the lighting of the fire to the last audible sound, took less than an hour. By noon, nothing remained but ash and charred bones, which the crusaders would scatter to prevent any relics from being collected. But something unexpected happened in that field of execution. Many who came to celebrate the triumph of orthodoxy left deeply shaken. Hardened soldiers wept. Catholic priests questioned their faith. The Archbishop of Narbonne, who had orchestrated the siege, was seen turning away from the pyre, his face grey with something that might have been doubt. The perfect's joy in dying challenged everything the Catholics believed about death, judgment, and salvation. If these heretics were damned, why did they seem so certain of paradise? The impact rippled outward through Occitania and beyond. The martyrdom of Montségur became a symbol not of Catholic triumph, but of Cathar transcendence. Secret believers whispered that lights had been seen ascending from the flames, that voices had been heard singing in the ruins weeks after the execution, that the very ground where the pyre stood refused to grow anything but white flowers. Whether true or not, these stories transformed defeat into a kind of victory, death into testimony that no inquisition could silence. Number, the machinery of questions. In a stone chamber beneath the Dominican monastery in Toulouse, Brother Bernard Gueux refined the systematic process that would extract confessions from even the most devoted believers. The year was 1260, and the Inquisition had evolved from crude violence into something far more terrifying, a bureaucratic machine that ground souls as efficiently as mills ground grain. Bernard had written a manual, the Practica Inquisitionis, that transformed interrogation into science. Every question had purpose, every silence had meaning, every answer led to more questions in an endless spiral that eventually trapped even the innocent. The manual instructed inquisitors to begin gently, with seemingly innocent inquiries about family, neighbours, daily routines. Only gradually would the questions narrow toward heresy, by which time the subject had already provided enough information to convict themselves or others. The physical setup of the interrogation chamber was precisely designed. The subject sat on a low stool, forcing them to look up at the inquisitor, who sat behind a raised table. Behind the inquisitor hung a crucifix, positioned so the subject couldn't avoid seeing it, a constant reminder of the authority questioning them. Scribes recorded every word, their scratching quills a soundtrack to fear. The windows were placed high and small, creating a sense of imprisonment even before any verdict was reached. Bernard understood that physical torture, while sometimes necessary, was less effective than psychological pressure. The threat of torture often produced more truth than torture itself, which tended to generate whatever confession would stop the pain. Instead, he developed subtler methods. Subjects were kept in solitary confinement for weeks, allowed no visitors, no news of their families, no knowledge of what others might have said about them. Uncertainty became its own torture. The questions followed patterns designed to trap. When did you last see a perfect? Assumed the subject had seen one. How many times have you attended Cathar sermons? Presumed attendance. Which of your neighbours share your beliefs? Implied the subject had beliefs to share. Denials were met with claims that others had already testified against them, true or not. The subject never knew what the inquisitor knew, what was suspicion and what was proof. The most insidious aspect was the recruitment of informers from among the converted. Those who had recanted were required to prove their orthodoxy by identifying others who still held heretical beliefs. Families were torn apart, as survival required betraying those closest to you. Children were questioned about their parents' practices, wives about their husbands' associates, brothers about sisters' prayers. The Inquisition transformed love into liability, trust into danger. Bernard kept meticulous records, creating files on thousands of families that tracked associations across generations. A grandfather who had once sheltered perfect meant grandchildren were automatically suspect. A cousin who had been burned created a stain that spread through entire bloodlines. These records were shared between inquisitors, creating a network of surveillance that spanned all of Occitania. There was no escaping one's past or one's connections. The punishments varied with careful gradation. Those who confessed immediately and showed proper repentance might receive only penance, pilgrimage to distant shrines, wearing yellow crosses that marked them as former heretics, financial penalties that enriched the church. Those who resisted but eventually confessed faced imprisonment, their property confiscated, their families destroyed. Those who refused to confess, or who confessed but later recanted, faced the flames. But perhaps the most effective tool was time itself. The Inquisition was patient, immortal, in a way that human resistance could never be. It might take years between first suspicion and final judgment. Subjects lived under constant surveillance, never knowing when they might be summoned, never free from fear. The machinery of questions ground on relentlessly, wearing down resistance like water, wearing down stone. Number, you hide the sacred text. You crouch in the root cellar of your farmhouse, your fingers trembling as you wrap the small book in oiled leather for the third time. Outside, you can hear horses approaching on the road from Toulouse. It might be merchants heading to market. It might be neighbours returning from the harvest. Or it might be the Inquisition, following information extracted from someone who saw you at a gathering 10 years ago, a child grown to adulthood who remembered strange visitors in black robes, a desperate soul who offered your name to save their own. The book is your grandmother's Occitan Gospel of John, the one she hid for 30 years after receiving the consolamentum, surviving on water and herbs, rather than renounce her faith. She pressed it into your hands the night before she died, whispering that the light must not be extinguished, that someone must remember the true teachings, even if they could no longer be spoken aloud. You were 12 then, too young to understand the weight of what you were accepting. Now, at 40, you understand too well. Your children play in the kitchen above, their laughter a painful reminder of what you risk. They know nothing of your faith, nothing of the book beneath their feet. You've raised them as perfect Catholics, ensuring they know their Latin prayers, attend every Mass, cross themselves at every mention of God's name. Their ignorance is their protection. If the Inquisitors come, their genuine shock at finding their parent is a heretic might save them from sharing your fate. The book itself is falling apart, its pages worn soft as cloth from decades of secret reading. You know entire passages by heart now, whispered in the darkness when your family sleeps, the words of light and liberation that the Church calls damnable heresy. Sometimes you wonder if you're the last one who remembers, if all the perfect are dead, and all the believers have recanted or fled. But then you see a sign, a white cross chalked on a wall, quickly erased but not before you've seen it, or an old woman at market who whispers, "The good Christians are not forgotten," while selling you eggs. The hoofbeats are getting closer. You must decide quickly. The root cellar has hidden the book through 3 searches, but the Inquisition has grown more thorough. They bring iron rods now to probe for hollow spaces, dogs trained to find hidden compartments. If they find it, you burn. If you destroy it, a sacred text that might be the last of its kind is lost forever. If you try to run with it, you mark yourself as guilty. You choose, as you always have, to preserve rather than protect yourself. The book goes into its hiding place, covered with turnips and old sacking that smells of rot. You climb back up to your kitchen, brush the dirt from your hands, and smile at your children as if your heart isn't breaking. When the horses pass without stopping, you breathe again, knowing you've won another day, another week, perhaps another month. But you also know that someday, maybe today, maybe years from now, someone will find that book and you will burn for it. And still, you cannot bring yourself to destroy it. The light, however hidden, must not be extinguished. Number, shadows beneath the mountains, in the deep caves that honeycomb the Pyrenees, where water drips its patient sculpture and darkness is absolute. The last 3 Cathars gather for what might be their final meeting. The year is 1290, nearly 50 years since Montségur fell, and those who remember the open practice of their faith are old, their numbers dwindling with each winter that claims the elderly and weak. The cave they've chosen requires a dangerous climb followed by a crawl through passages barely wide enough for a body. No accidental traveller would find them here. No inquisitor would brave these depths without certainty of success. The darkness is their cathedral now, the dripping water their hymns, the stone itself their only witness to prayers that once filled sunny marketplaces. Brother André, one of the last perfect, can no longer make the journey. He was consoled in his youth when hundreds still lived openly in Montségur, and now at 70, his legs won't carry him up the mountain paths. So the believers come to him, one or two at a time, never the same route twice, never on predictable days. He gives them what teaching he can, though he worries that without proper transmission, without the full ceremony of consolamentum performed by multiple, perfect, the apostolic succession that links them to Christ's disciples will be broken. Tonight, perhaps 20 believers have gathered, each having told different lies to explain their absence. A shepherd checking on lost sheep, a merchant travelling to a distant fair, a widow visiting her sister's grave. They share bread and water, the simple meal that has replaced the elaborate Catholic Mass. They speak in whispers, though the rock walls would muffle any sound before it reached the surface. The discussion turns, as it always does now, to whether they should flee to Lombardy, where Cathars still find some protection, or remain in the land their families have inhabited for centuries. The young argue for exodus, for keeping the faith alive even in foreign soil. The old speak of bones in the cemetery that call them to stay, of mountains that know their names, of a duty to remain as witnesses, even unto death. They pray together in the absolute darkness, and in that darkness, differences dissolve. Noble and peasant, man and woman, old and young become simply souls yearning for light. The darkness is complete, but not oppressive. It feels, one believer whispers, like the darkness before creation, full of potential, waiting for the good God to speak light into being again. Number, the last perfect. Guillaume Bellibaste stood before his executioners in the castle courtyard of Villarouge-Termenès on August 24th, 1321, knowing he was the last perfect ordained in the traditional way, the last link in the chain of consolamentum reaching back to the apostles, the last living testimony to a faith that had once claimed thousands. His death would end not just a life, but a tradition, a theology, a different way of understanding God's relationship to creation. Guillaume had not chosen to be last. He had fled to Lombardy after Montségur, lived among the Cathar communities there, watched them too succumb to persecution and dispersion. He had wandered to Catalonia, earning bread as a shepherd, performing consolamentum for dying believers when he could, always moving, always watching for the agents of the Inquisition, who never stopped hunting. For 40 years, he had survived where others had been caught, not through exceptional cleverness, but through the simple expedient of absolute poverty that made him invisible to those who expected heretics to have something worth confiscating. His capture came through betrayal, as it always did by then. A supposed believer, named Arnaud Sicret, had spent years gaining Guillaume's trust, claiming his own family had been destroyed by the Inquisition, expressing desire to receive the consolamentum. When Guillaume finally agreed to travel back into France to console Arnaud's dying aunt, he walked into a trap that had been years in the making. The Inquisition had learned patience from its victims. At his trial, Guillaume had been offered the usual bargains: reveal the names of believers, recant his errors, embrace Catholic truth, and live. He had responded with a detailed exposition of Cathar theology that the scribes dutifully recorded, creating one of the most complete accounts of what the perfect actually believed. He spoke of the two principles, the nature of Christ as pure spirit, the evil of the material world, the ultimate salvation of all souls. He spoke not to convince his judges, whom he knew were beyond convincing, but for history, for whoever might read these records and understand. Now, facing the pyre, Guillaume performed his own consolamentum, the perfect empowered to self-administer the sacrament in extremis. He spoke the words that thousands had spoken before him, but this time with no one to carry them forward. The apostolic succession that the Cathars claimed, that spiritual authority transmitted from Jesus through the apostles, through generations of perfect, would end in this courtyard. Whatever survived would be memory, not ministry. As the flames rose, Guillaume called out a prophecy that the scribes also recorded. perhaps thinking it would demonstrate heretical delusion. He said that in 700 years, the laurel would green again. Believers would later interpret this as predicting a revival of their faith, though what form that might take, what truth might emerge from the ashes of their tradition, remained a mystery that time alone would reveal. Number stones that remember. The ruins of Mont Ségur stand against the sky like broken teeth, worn by 8 centuries of wind and rain, but still defiant, still claiming their impossible perch above the world. Tourists climb the steep path now, pausing to catch their breath where perfect once paused to pray, taking photographs where believers once took consolamentum. The stones themselves remain silent about what they've witnessed, but their silence speaks to those who know how to listen. In the castle's eastern wall, you can still see the scorch marks from the Crusaders' catapults, black stains that rain has never washed clean. The cisterns that collected water still hold morning dew, reflecting sky as they once reflected the faces of the besieged. The narrow windows that archers once defended now frame views of mountains that look exactly as they did when the perfects sang their final hymns. Archaeologists have found small things: a bone needle dropped by someone mending a robe, a chess piece carved from local stone, fragments of pottery that once held the simple meals of the perfect. These objects, mundane in themselves, become relics of a vanished world. Someone's fingers shaped that needle, moved that chess piece, ate from that bowl. The objects outlasted their users, matter proving more durable than the spirits that despised it. The field where the pyre burned is marked now by a modern monument, a simple stele that lists no names because the names weren't recorded, only the number, 225. Visitors leave flowers, stones, sometimes copies of Cathar texts printed from academic studies. The memorial accumulates these offerings like sediment, each addition a small act of remembrance for people who believed memory was less important than transcendence. Number the treasure that vanished. 2 nights before Mont Ségur fell, according to testimony extracted by the Inquisition decades later, 4 perfect escaped down the sheer western face of the mountain, using ropes, carrying something. What they carried, where they took it, and what became of it has spawned centuries of speculation, treasure hunting, and myth-making that says more about the seekers than the sought. The Inquisition believed it was gold and silver, the accumulated donations of believers, wealth that should have been confiscated for the church. They tortured survivors for information, searched the mountains for years, followed every rumour and whisper. They found nothing, which only convinced them that vast treasures remained hidden, protected by heretical magic or demonic assistance. Later, Romantics imagined sacred texts, the complete Cathar Bible that would reveal their secret knowledge, perhaps even Gospels unknown to the Catholic Church. They envisioned libraries hidden in caves, protected by elaborate traps, waiting for the worthy to discover them. Expeditions combed the Pyrenees, usually finding only bat guano and their own disappointment, occasionally discovering a medieval coin or tool that fueled further searching. The Nazis, obsessed with occult power, believed the treasure was the Holy Grail itself, that the Cathars had been its guardians, that their dualist theology encoded directions to its hiding place. Otto Rahn spent years in the region in the 1930s, writing books that connected the Cathars to everything from Atlantis to Aryan mysticism, theories that revealed nothing about medieval heretics, but much about 20th century delusions. More sober historians suggest the treasure was probably the Cathar episcopal records, the documents that prove their apostolic succession, their theological texts, perhaps personal letters from perfect to believers. These would have been invaluable to surviving Cathars, trying to maintain their faith underground. They would also explain why nothing was ever found, paper and parchment being notably biodegradable when hidden in damp caves. But perhaps the most intriguing theory, suggested by the timing and the risk involved, is that the treasure was not objects but people, 4 perfect, carrying away not gold but children, perhaps the offspring of important believers, perhaps young people who had received emergency consolamentum and needed to be spirited to safety. Humans would explain why no hidden cache was ever found, why the Inquisition's searches proved fruitless. The treasure walked away on its own legs, grew up in distant lands, carried the memory if not the practice of a murdered faith. Whatever the truth, the mystery of Montsegu's treasure serves a purpose beyond historical curiosity. It suggests that something escaped, that the Inquisition's victory was not complete, that somewhere in cave or memory or bloodline, the light the Cathars served found shelter from the darkness they believed ruled this world. The treasure, real or imagined, material or spiritual, becomes a symbol of survival, of truths that power cannot completely suppress. Number Occitan dreams. In the village squares of modern Languedoc, on warm summer evenings when the air smells of lavender and history, you can hear the old language being spoken again. Occitan, the tongue of troubadours and perfect, suppressed for centuries in favour of French, is experiencing a quiet revival. Not a return to dominance, but a remembering, a recognition that language carries more than words, that in its rhythms and constructions lie different ways of understanding the world. The children learning Occitan in cultural centres don't know they're speaking the language of heretics. They learn songs about larks and spring flowers, not about the evil of matter and the liberation of souls. But sometimes, in the older songs, fragments surface like bones working up through soil, a reference to the good men who walk the roads, a metaphor about light trapped in darkness, a lullaby about going home to a country that isn't on any map. The revival is partly tourism, the marketing of difference that transforms tragedy into heritage, Cathar castle tours, Cathar wine, Cathar restaurants, serving vegetarian meals that perfect might have eaten, if they'd eaten much at all. The yellow crosses that marked former heretics for shame are now sold as jewellery. The sites of massacres have parking lots and gift shops. History becomes commodity, which the Cathars, who rejected all material commerce, might have found ironically appropriate. But beneath the commercialization, something deeper stirs. The landscape itself remembers. In the terraced vineyards the Cathars tended, in the mountain paths they walked, in the caves where they hid, the culture remembers, in its suspicion of northern authority, its tradition of tolerance, its pride in difference. The people remember, not the theology that died with Guillaume Bellibaste, but the sense that once their ancestors chose their own path to God and suffered for that choosing. Number. Echoes in the archives. In the Vatican's secret archives, in climate-controlled rooms where scholars must wear white gloves to handle documents, sit thousands of pages of Inquisition records from 13th century Languedoc. These transcripts, intended to document the eradication of heresy, have become the primary source for understanding what the Cathars actually believed and how they lived. The irony is perfect. The Inquisition, by recording what it sought to destroy, became the unwitting preservationist of Cathar memory. The testimonies reveal a world far more complex than either Catholic or Cathar orthodoxy would suggest. Here is Beatrice de Planisoles, minor nobility, confessing to a decade-long affair with a Catholic priest who was secretly a Cathar believer, their theological debates intertwined with their physical relationship. Here is Pierre Maury, a shepherd, describing how perfect would leave coloured stones at crossroads to mark safe houses, a sophisticated network of communication invisible to authorities. Here is Sybil Pera, explaining how she hid Cathar texts inside Catholic prayer books, the heretical words literally covered by orthodox ones. The most poignant records are the formulaic ones, the hundreds of nearly identical confessions that reveal the Inquisition's bureaucratic efficiency. Name, age, occupation, when last confessed, when first encountered heresy, names of perfect seen, names of believers known. The repetition transforms individual tragedies into statistics, but occasionally a detail breaks through. A woman who mentions that the perfect blessed her dying child when the priest wouldn't come because she couldn't pay. A man who explains he became a believer after seeing perfect share their only bread with strangers. Between the lines of these confessions, you can read the destruction of a civilization, extended families torn apart as members informed on each other. Economic networks collapsed as merchants were burned or fled. Entire villages depopulated as survivors migrated to cities where anonymity offered protection. The Inquisition records document not just the suppression of a heresy, but the systematic dismantling of a way of life that had flourished for centuries. Yet the records also reveal the incomplete nature of the victory, references to believers who were never caught, to perfect who disappeared without trace, to books that were hidden and never found. The frustration of inquisitors shows through in marginal notes. The witness is clearly lying, but we cannot prove it. The entire village knows, but will not speak. They help each other hide the faust, truth. Even under torture, facing death, some kernel of resistance survived that all the machinery of persecution couldn't crush. Number the light that would not die. 3 centuries after Guillaume Bellibas burned, Martin Luther nailed his theses to a church door, and Europe exploded into religious warfare that would make the Albigensian Crusade look like a local skirmish. The Protestant reformers didn't know they were echoing Cathar criticisms, but the parallels were unmistakable. Rejection of papal authority, emphasis on scripture over tradition, criticism of church wealth and corruption, the principle that salvation came through faith rather than through sacraments administered by priests. The Catholic Counter-Reformation, with its renewed emphasis on mysticism, personal devotion, and spiritual poverty, unconsciously absorbed some of what had made Catharism attractive. New orders like the Capuchins embraced radical poverty that would have impressed the perfect. Mystics like John of the Cross wrote of the dark night of the soul in terms that Cathar dualists might have recognized. The church that had burned heretics for claiming direct connection to God began producing saints who claimed exactly that. In the secular sphere, the Cathar legacy lived on in the principle of religious tolerance that slowly, painfully emerged from the ashes of religious war. The destruction of Occitan civilization became a cautionary tale about the dangers of enforcing orthodoxy through violence. The troubadour tradition, scattered to the winds, seeded the Renaissance focus on human emotion and individual experience. The questions the Cathars raised about evil, suffering, and the nature of creation continue to challenge theologians and philosophers. The 19th century Romantic movement rediscovered the Cathars, transforming them from medieval heretics into heroic rebels against oppression. Napoleon III ordered the restoration of Cathar castles, not from religious sympathy, but from recognition that they represented resistance to central authority. Writers and poets found in the Cathars a symbol of spiritual authenticity crushed by institutional power. The tragedy of Montsegur became an opera, a novel, a nationalist symbol for southern French identity. Even in modern New Age movements, diluted and distorted, though the connection might be, something of Cathar thought persists. The idea that the material world is a prison for the spirit, that enlightenment comes through knowledge rather than faith, that traditional religious authority has corrupted original truth. These concepts resurface in countless contemporary spiritual movements. The vocabulary changes, but the questions remain. Why do we suffer? Is this world our true home? Can the spirit transcend matter? Number. Return to Montsegur. Sarah climbs the path to Montsegur on a morning in March, exactly 779 years after the perfect walked down this same path to their deaths. She is not a Cathar, not really. That tradition died with Guillaume Bellibas. She is not even particularly religious. But something draws her here, some combination of historical curiosity and spiritual hunger that she couldn't quite articulate when she left her hotel in Toulouse before dawn. The climb is harder than she expected. The tourist websites mentioned it was steep, but didn't convey the reality of scrambling over rocks worn smooth by millions of footsteps, of paths that seem designed to test commitment rather than provide access. She stops frequently, not just from exhaustion, but from awareness that Perfect made this climb regularly, often while fasting, sometimes carrying books or sick believers seeking consolamentum. At the summit, she finds herself almost alone, too early for tourist buses, too cloudy for spectacular photographs. Just her and an elderly French couple who nod silently and move away, granting her solitude with the ruins. She sits on a stone that might have been part of a wall, might have sheltered Perfect from mountain winds, might have witnessed the last sunrise before the surrender. The silence is profound, not empty, but full, pregnant with absence. Here stood buildings full of life, voices raised in prayer and debate, children playing despite the siege, lovers meeting despite the prohibition, humans being human, even while reaching for transcendence. Now only wind and stone, and the occasional cry of a hawk riding thermals up the valley. Sarah finds herself crying without quite knowing why. For the Perfect who died rather than deny their truth. For the civilization destroyed in the name of unity. For all the seekers throughout history who have climbed mountains, literal and metaphorical, searching for something beyond the material given. Or simply for herself, another searcher who doesn't quite know what she's seeking, only that the conventional answers haven't satisfied. She stays until the tourist buses arrive, their diesel engines and guide megaphones breaking the spell. As she descends, passing cheerful tourists, making the climb she just completed, she carries something down with her. Not enlightenment, not conversion, not even clear understanding, but a sense that once, on this mountain, people chose death over betraying their vision of truth. That choice, whatever one thinks of their theology, means something. In a world that often seems to offer only comfortable compromises, the Perfect's absolute commitment stands as challenge or inspiration or warning, perhaps all three. Number, when dawn breaks over the Pyrenees. The sun rises over the Pyrenees, as it has every morning since these mountains thrust themselves from the seafloor millions of years ago, indifferent to human tragedy and triumph alike. The light that the Cathars worshipped as metaphor streams across peaks where they made their last stands, through valleys where they preached their radical gospel, over ruins where they chose death, rather than surrender their understanding of truth. In Toulouse, the red brick of the city that once sheltered hundreds of Perfect, now glows rose gold in the dawn light. The cathedral, where Cathars were condemned, stands next to university buildings where scholars study their theology. The same squares where believers burned now host markets selling organic vegetables and artisanal crafts, a peculiar echo of the Cathars' rejection of industrial corruption. The city has grown beyond its medieval walls, spreading across the plain in concrete and glass, but at its heart, the old questions remain. The legacy of the Cathars is not in doctrine, rescued, or practices preserved. Their apostolic succession ended with Guillaume Bellibaste. Their texts were burned. Their theology was systematically eradicated. What survives is more subtle and perhaps more powerful. The memory that once an entire civilization chose differently. They proved that Christianity could develop in radically different directions, that orthodox wasn't inevitable, that humans could imagine God and salvation, and the purpose of existence in ways that threatened established power, so fundamentally that only annihilation could remove the threat. They also demonstrated the terrible cost of such choosing. The price of rejecting the dominant paradigm was not just individual martyrdom, but cultural extinction. Occitania, that flowering of tolerance and poetry and alternative possibility, was ground into conformity with the rest of medieval Europe. The troubadours fell silent, the language was suppressed, the economic networks were destroyed, the social structures were replaced. What emerged was more unified but less diverse, more orthodox but less creative, more controlled but less free. yet something indestructible survived. Call it the human tendency toward dissent, the inability of power to completely eliminate alternative visions, the persistence of questions that orthodox answers don't quite satisfy. In every generation since the Cathars, someone has asked why a good God permits evil, whether matter and spirit are truly united or fundamentally separate, whether salvation comes through institution or inspiration. The vocabulary changes, the context shifts, but the essential inquiry remains. The perfect would perhaps find it ironic that they are remembered at all. They sought to escape history, to transcend the material world with its cycles of birth and death, memory and forgetting. They wanted neither monuments nor chronicles, neither relics nor revenge. They wanted only to return to the light from which they believed all souls had fallen, to end the exile in matter that they experienced as suffering, even when it appeared as pleasure. Instead, they became history. Their very attempt to escape matter transformed into material for books, films, tourist attractions, academic conferences, conspiracy theories, and spiritual movements they would barely recognize. The Cathar cross, which they rarely used, now appears on everything from wine bottles to jewelry. Montségur, which they saw as a temporary shelter for eternal souls, became a permanent symbol of resistance. Their theology, which promised escape from the world, became part of the world's theological heritage. Thank you for joining me in visiting these distant memories. The morning light continues to spread across the Pyrenees, illuminating peaks and valleys with equal indifference. Somewhere in the mountains, in caves sealed centuries ago, there may still be hidden texts, final testimonies of the perfect, written in extremis. Somewhere in the genes of southern French families, there may be descendants of believers who kept their ancestry secret through generations. Somewhere in the questions that won't quite go away, in the dissatisfaction with easy answers, in the human refusal to accept that might makes right or that power determines truth, the Cathar spirit continues its long journey home. The stones of Montségur will outlast our civilization as they outlasted the one that built them. Wind and rain will eventually reduce them to sand. The mountain itself will erode. The sun that rises this morning will one day expand to consume the earth entirely. The Cathars would say this proves their point, that matter is temporary, corrupted, doomed. Others would say it makes matter precious, worth cherishing precisely because it passes. The argument continues, as perhaps it must, as perhaps it should. It's been a privilege to bring these calming chronicles to your evening. May ancient peace settle over you like a gentle blanket.